Thanks for that introduction, Yap. And I'm really happy to be speaking here. The talk today is based on the research that I did as a journalist to write the book that Yap mentioned, The Man Who Wasn't There. And as it happened, the first trip that I took to start my research was to a place in India called Sarnath, which is where the Buddha is supposed to have given his first sermons, including his second sermon on the concept of no self. And as it also happened, I stayed, when I was visiting Sarnath, I stayed in Rajghat at the Krishnamurti Study Center for a few days. So somehow all of this journey for me began with some connections to Krishnamurti's Study Center in Rajghat. So what I want to talk about today is about the human sense of self from the perspective of neuropsychological conditions. Each of these conditions disrupt the self in a certain way, and the idea is to figure out whether we can understand the lived experiences of people with these conditions and then correlate them with what science is saying about what might be happening and make sense of how the brain and body together might be constructing our larger sense of self, right? When we say our sense of self, I think intuitively all of us know what that means, even though we are constantly quibbling about the definitions. But there is in a fundamental sense, we are internally aware of what that means. One of, for instance, it's there when we wake up, it disappears when we go to sleep, it reappears in our dreams without trying to define what it is. That's our sense of self. It's also the sense of being a body, being an embodied person here and now. It's also the sense that we have of being an entity that spans time to some remembered past all the way to some imagined future, right? There is this intuition we have of a continuity, that it's the same entity that exists. So all of these things go towards making our sense of self. And when we put it like that, one might ask, so what is the big deal? What are we trying to understand? Well, that's all there is to it. And I actually like to read out a quote for you. Jaime, is it working? So you'll have to excuse us. We're trying out some newfangled technology right now. Did you do that? Did I do that? Who was the agent of the action? So anyway, while he's trying to figure that out, this quote from philosopher Thomas Nagel, if I can read it out to you, it kind of sets up the mystery for us. He says, "It seems outlandish that the centerless universe, in all its spatio-temporal immensity, should have produced me of all people. There was no such thing as me for ages, but with the formation of a particular physical organism at a particular place and time, suddenly there is me for as long as the organism survives. How can the existence of one member of one species have this remarkable consequence?" Right? When you start thinking like this, you realize that there is a profound mystery that needs to be answered, or at least when you start thinking about it in this term, like in the way Nagel poses it, that there is a mystery. Our clickers, unfortunately. All right, so I'll just signal to you then. Yeah. And when philosophers, theologians, neuroscientists start thinking about the self, the sense of self, and we'll start making the distinction between those two words, the sense of self and the self, they are essentially concerned, to give you a general idea, they're concerned about two kinds of unities that we perceive. One is something called something they call synchronic unity, and I'm going to say they because I am not the philosopher, I'm not the neuroscientist, I'm not the theologian. I have gone and talked to all of them, including one of my favorite philosophers who's sitting here, Thomas Metzinger. So I am more like all of you, just trying to explore this, and having gone into some depth, I will tell you what I found out. Right? So synchronic unity is this unity that we all feel at this moment. Like, for instance, you're hearing me speak, you're seeing me speak, you're also aware of the tactile sensations of your bodies as you're sitting on your chairs. And if you ponder on that for a moment, you'll realize that all of these feelings, sensations, perceptions are happening to the same entity. It's not as if one person is hearing the sound within you and another person is having the visual input and yet another person is perceiving the tactile sensations, right? It's the same entity that is perceiving all of this as if it's happening to the same entity. Now, it might seem trivial, but neuroscientifically and philosophically, this is an important thing to explain. Why is there this perception of a unified entity, or rather an entity that has a unified experience of all of the things that are happening at this moment in time, right? And that's called synchronic unity. And there's another kind of unity that is there within all of us, which is what philosophers call diachronic unity, which is this sense we have of being an entity that spans time. So when you think back to when you were a 4-year-old child, or when you have when you imagine yourself in the future 10 years from now, and those rememberings or imaginings bring up certain feelings, perceptions, thoughts, etc., they all seem to be happening to the same entity again. It's not as if the 4-year-old entity feels different from the thing that's doing the experiencing now versus the entity that experiences an imagined future. There's again a sense of unity that spans time, and philosophers call this diachronic unity. And it's the existence of this experience of unity that they're trying to explain, that they're trying to understand. And because they're trying to explain this and understand this, you start getting into debates about, is there then some entity that actually exists that can create this unity? So the idea of the existence of a self starts coming about because people start arguing that there must be something that underlies this unity. So there must be a self that collates all the sensations that's happening to you at this moment in time and makes it feel as if there is one experiencing entity, or there must be a self that exists over time that takes all of the stuff that has happened and will happen and make it feel like it's happening to the same entity, right? So, and so when philosophers, theologians, neuroscientists start thinking about these questions with this structure in mind, that's when these questions start arising. Is there a self or is there not a self? And also in a much more fundamental sense, they start asking the question, can the self exist independently of all else? Now, what one means by that is this material world, we can decompose it into its constituents, electrons, gluons, quarks, etc., right? And those are the material things that we can break down our overall material reality, and we say that that's the ontological reality of the material world. Now, does the self have its separate ontological reality? Can it exist separate from all of the material stuff that makes us? So if our bodies were to disappear, will there still be something left that we can call the self, right? So that's what they argue about. Can we show or not? Can we show that the self has an ontological status besides material reality, right? So that's one of the questions they asked. And of course, the other question that came up during the last session, we've constantly heard this, that the self is an illusion, and this comes about in a lot of different forums, books, in theology, in philosophy, etc. And the question then is, if the self is an illusion, then depending on how you define the word illusion, you have to ask the question, whose illusion is it, right? So these questions are pervasive there, and we'll kind of dig into some of these issues by looking at what's happening with certain neuropsychological conditions. So I just want to read out a couple of other quotes. One of the things we should remember and probably appreciate is that these questions about the self are not new, right? They go back probably to the time humans became self-aware. Of course, recorded history gives us certain main figures who have done a lot of the thinking, but I would imagine each one of us thinks about the nature of the self in some way or the other. Some are better at it than others, and over recorded history we have certain people who have made comments about it that we then keep going back to. One of them is David Hume, a Scottish philosopher, who said, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. So today philosophers would classify him as most philosophers would classify him as a bundle theorist. And what that means is he's basically saying all we are is a bundle of perceptions, and if you go in and look for a center which is the subject of these perceptions, you will find nothing, right? So there is an appearance of a center because we are a bundle of perceptions. And I won't try to, I don't know how many of you recognize the script. This is Sanskrit. If I was more confident, I would actually read it aloud to you, but I'm not. Maybe Hillary can, maybe later. This is a stanza, this is a stanza from a poem from, I think, the 6th century AD called Nirvana Shatkam by Adi Shankara. It belongs to the Advaitin non-dualist school of thinking, and it's a 6-stanza poem in which the approach that is taken to answer the question, who am I, is by first saying what I am not, right? So if you go to the next slide, this is the English translation which I can read out. I am not the mind, nor the intellect, nor any entity that identifies self with the ears, tongue, nose, or the eyes, not even perceived by space, earth, light, or the wind. I am, and I've deliberately left out the answer. Every stanza in that poem, the last line is a particular answer to the question, who am I? But it's an answer that is specific to the Advaitin tradition, right? So they have their answer to the question, who am I? I was interested in this approach because it can be applied to, to the modern understanding of the sense of self. When we look at neuropsychological conditions, we can start unpacking the sense of self by using this kind of approach. Am I my body? Am I my thoughts? Am I this? Am I that? And you can sort of start negating and still keep trying to come at the essence of the I, trying to answer the question, what or who am I, right? So there are other ways, and in the morning, Yap showed how we could talk about the self in many different ways, and these are categories that William James, an American psychologist, came up with, which are instructive. He, for instance, divided the self, the sense of self, into thinking about it as the material self. Anything that classifies as me or mine, he said that's your material self. He talked of a social self. A social self, in his way of thinking, was, it's that part of the self which depends on an interaction with others. It's something that's formulated based on a social interaction. So basically, there are as many social selves within each of us as there are interactions with others. And the way to think about it is, if you are interacting with your parent, you feel a certain way. If you're interacting with a friend or a child, you'll feel differently. And those are all different kinds of social selves that are within you. They're not clear boundaries, but it's basically every social interaction makes you feel a certain way. Your sense of self is basically what you feel at any given moment, right? And that moment, that feeling at that moment is dictated by a certain social interaction, and that would be a certain kind of social self you would have. He also talks of the spiritual self. He would say that a person's inner psychic faculties constitute the spiritual self. Again, these are categories that you can slice and dice your sense of self in any which way. There was a paper by, I think it was a philosopher called Galen Strawson, where he identified that people have been dividing the self, and he counted the different ways in which you can sort of compartmentalize the sense of self, and he came up with 27 different categories. William James also came up with something else which he called the implicit self and the explicit self. This I find more instructive. The implicit self is the sense of self that we have of just existing as an entity which is doing the perceiving and from which actions are emanating. We have this implicit sense of being. It is pre-verbal, pre-language, doesn't require conceptualization. It just, you are just something to to which things are happening and from which things actions are emanating, right? Explicit self is that part of ourself which actually requires conceptualization, which requires language to talk about. So when you're talking about yourself to someone or talking about yourself to yourself, you're conceptualizing who you are. That is an explicit self, and this is another way of thinking about how you can divide up what the self is. And in the book that I wrote, I ended up kind of focusing on a slightly different kind of division, which is the narrative self and the bodily self. But this again is something all of us will relate to. The narrative self is most likely the kind of self that we are most familiar with. So when I ask the question, who am I, to one of you, you will very likely give an answer in the form of a story. You're going to say, I'm so and so, I was born here, I moved from here to there, I'm married, not married, I have children, I have no children, whatever your story is, right? You're going to talk about yourself in the form of a story. And that is your narrative self, that is your autobiographical self. You have in your, even without having to tell anyone about it, even within us, we conceptualize ourselves as stories. And that is the narrative self. And there's also something that we can call the bodily self. Now, to an answer to the question, who am I, it's very unlikely that any of you is going to say, oh, I'm just a body sitting here, right? You're going to tell me your name, age, etc., but you're not going to say, I'm just a body sitting here experiencing light and sound. But that's also what we are. Each one of us is a body right now, occupying a certain volume of space, identifying with a certain body, right? You are not identifying with his body and vice versa, right? We identify with a particular body, and these might seem trivial, but you'll see as we look at the neuropsychological conditions that these come apart. And also we have a first-person perspective. We all have this sense of looking out at the world from behind our eyes, and we all have this sense that whatever is being perceived by each one of us is private to us, that my perceptions are private to me. So all of those constitute are attributes of what can be called the bodily self. It's just the sense of being a body here and now, perceiving, sensing, that's it, right? And then the narrative self is something that's built over the bodily self. Again, the distinctions are blurry, but I'm just using those words. And in the book, what I did then was look at these set of neuropsychological conditions. Alzheimer's disease, some of these you will be unfortunately familiar with, because either you know someone, maybe you know someone who's suffering from any one of these conditions: Alzheimer's, body integrity identity disorder, schizophrenia, depersonalization, autism, hortoscopic phenomena, which is out-of-body experiences fall under this phenomena, ecstatic epilepsy, and Courthouse Syndrome. I'll go through briefly and tell you what these are. Some you're probably not aware of. They are much more rare than, say, something like Alzheimer's, which is unfortunately getting more and more common, or schizophrenia. So let's look at Alzheimer's disease and see what it tells us about the nature of the self, right? How many of you know people suffering from Alzheimer's? Right, a fair number of people, yeah. And so you're well aware that the first thing that Alzheimer's starts doing is it starts impacting short-term memory formation, right? So you literally don't remember something that just happened. And if you meet someone who has, say, early to mid-stage Alzheimer's disease, where they're still able to talk to you and can talk about themselves, one of the things you will notice, if you know their life story, and if you know exactly what their life story is, and you start talking to them about what they're telling you about their life story, you'll realize that they're actually scrambling up their narrative, that they can't put sequences together. They can't quite tell what happened when. So it's in a manner of speaking, their narrative is getting scrambled. So the first thing that happens is short-term memory formation is disrupted. And if short-term memory formation is disrupted, if something is not entering short-term memory, then that whatever has happened now is also not entering long-term memory, right? And when you think of what our narrative self is, a narrative self is a sequence of episodes. This is now speaking very simplistically, but a narrative self is a sequence of episodes along a timeline in our heads, and in order for that narrative self to form, all these episodes should enter long-term memory. They should be in our long-term memory. Now, if you don't, for instance, if none of us remembers this event, which would be a damning indictment of my talk, but let's say we don't remember this, right? It doesn't become part of our narrative self. So, say 1 year from now, if somebody asks you, did you go to the KFA to listen to this talk? Well, no, I didn't, because if it didn't enter your long-term memory, it's not part of your narrative self. So, one of the things Alzheimer's does early on is it stops the formation of the narrative self. The narrative self, the story stops forming at the point of disease onset, right? And then, unfortunately, the next stage of the disease, it starts scrambling the existing narrative. The disease starts messing with memory, and if you think of your narrative self as a sequence of episodes, then the temporal ordering of that narrative self starts getting scrambled. So if you're talking to someone with mid-stage Alzheimer's, if you don't know their story, you won't be able to tell. But if you do know what has happened to them, what their life story was, you will be able to tell that they're actually mixing it up, and they're not aware of it internally, very likely. Like that's how it's coming out to them. By the end stages, unfortunately, this entire narrative self is disrupted. So the cognitive decline is so serious that the person is unable to recognize anyone, they're unable to take care of themselves, and caregivers will soon start talking about how this person doesn't have a self, or they'll start saying there is no one in there anymore, right? Or the person I knew is no more, right? Remember, these are all observations from the outside. We have no idea. We have no way to ask the person with Alzheimer's what is their subjective perception of being someone with end-stage Alzheimer's disease, right? Now, what Alzheimer's disease does is it challenges certain notions of the narrative self or the self within philosophy. So there have been philosophers over time who have argued that all we are, the sense of I, the sense of being an I, comes from these stories that our brains construct, right? There's a very nice phrase that philosopher Daniel Dennett uses. He calls the self as being the center of narrative gravity, right? Just like physical objects, this table, for instance, or each one of us has a center of gravity, right? It is a physical property of a distribution of matter, but there's no, if you actually go looking for that center of gravity, there is no one molecule or atom that you can point and say, oh, that is the center of gravity, right? It is a property of the distribution of the matter. And Dan Dennett says the self is somewhat like that. The sense of an I comes from, because there are narratives swirling around, there is a sense of being an I at the center of that narrative, but if you go looking for it, there is nothing. There are other philosophers who have argued that if you take away the narrative, then the sense of the I completely goes away. There is nothing except the narratives. Alzheimer's challenges that, right? Because, for instance, in middle stage Alzheimer's, the narrative is scrambled, and no one in their right minds would say that the person's I is somehow diminished, right? The I is still there, but it's experiencing a scrambled narrative. Now, the other thing that Alzheimer's challenges is the idea that the narrative self is purely cognitive, right? That it needs us to recall memories and construct a story and be able to talk about that story, and it's all somehow a cognitive act. And that way of thinking about the narrative self ignores the body. And throughout this talk, I'm going to use the word body, but when I say the word body, I also mean that the body is very intimately connected to the brain and vice versa. They are really not separate things. There are different functions that they all, the parts of the body do versus what the brain does, but in a sense, it's a continuum. So the idea that the narrative self is somehow just a cognitive act is also challenged by Alzheimer's. I'll tell you a story about what one of the researchers I was talking to, a sociologist who works with elderly Alzheimer's patients in Toronto at this Jewish care center. She was narrating an incident where it was a Jewish high holiday. I think it was Simchat Cinta Torah, does that make sense? The name of the holiday. And anyway, they were all standing in line to go to the bima, the pulpit, and say a prayer. And one of her patients also stood in line. He was a 90-plus-year-old man who was in such advanced stages of Alzheimer's that he couldn't even put two words together. Right? But he stood in line to go and say a prayer, and she was feeling panicked for him, wondering what he would do when he would reach the pulpit. He reached the pulpit and said a prayer with seeming proficiency, and came back. And she was completely shocked. And then the way she made sense of it, she said, you can argue that it was a cognitive act, that he could think up a prayer and say it, but it was also true that his cognition was really very badly shot because of the disease. He could not say two words together, but here he said a whole prayer. And her explanation was that it was an embodied self coming forth. It was the presence of the rabbi, the presence of the congregation, his hand on the Torah, all of that elicited a certain kind of selfhood that was embodied. It was not just a cognitive act, right? And to better appreciate what this means, think of something like, riding a bicycle, right? When somebody asks you about your narrative self, you are not going to be thinking, oh, I can ride a bicycle. But you can, if you have learned it, you can ride a bicycle. It is part of your narrative. You are a bicycle rider, right? Now, that is not something you consciously recall when you're trying to ride a bicycle. It is an embodied act. There's a lot of selfhood that becomes embodied, and Alzheimer's starts challenging. There's another anecdote about Aaron Copland, the American conductor who also had Alzheimer's, and towards the end stages of his disease, or probably not the very end, but somewhere in the middle, he was forgetful. He wouldn't remember where he was, but if you stood him in front of his orchestra, he could conduct his signature orchestral tune, the Appalachian Spring. I mean, so there was an embodied selfhood, things that had been learned over and over again that came forth, right? So the narrative self is not just a cognitive thing, it's also an embodied thing. The other thing that Alzheimer's challenges is this idea that once the narrative, whether it's the cognitive narrative self or the embodied narrative self, if both are gone, that there is no one left who is the experiencer of the sensation. So somebody with end-stage Alzheimer's just sitting on a chair, or for some unfortunate reason feeling pain, do they not feel the sensations as happening to someone or something? I'm being careful or imprecise with words because we don't know what to say about that at that point. We don't know the answer to that question because we can't ask the person with Alzheimer's, right? But philosophers today, neuroscientists today would argue that no, hang on, it's not, you can't say that there is no experiencer of sensations left. That experiencer of sensations may not have a narrative, may not be able to tell you a story about who they are, but they might still feel like being the subject of certain experiences like touch or pain or hunger, right? Who or what is that I that is the subject of those experiences? So Alzheimer starts posing these questions, and these are the kind of questions we can start asking about the nature of the self. So another condition that really sheds light on certain aspects of the bodily self. This is called body integrity identity disorder. How many know what this is? So very few, right? And the reason is because it's an extremely rare condition, and it's basically the way to understand this. If you look at your own hands or legs right now, or don't even look at them, just just have a sense of your arms and legs. It feels like your own. It's actually a silly question to be asking. Of course, it feels like my own, you'll say, right? Well, it turns out there are people who will say that no, there are certain parts of my body. Usually, it's the extremities of limbs, like the extremities of legs or their arms, that don't feel like their own. Now, this is very, very curious. So, for those of us who can't experience it, and I really personally have no way of knowing what that feels like. But it is an extremely debilitating condition to those people who experience it, especially if it lasts for a lot of them it lasts a lifetime. By the time they've been struggling with it for 10, 20, 30 years, they will take matters into their own hands. They will actually go and amputate that part of their body, that part of their leg or arm. I actually talk to a lot of people who have got such amputations. And trying to make sense of what's happening here is quite difficult at one level, because it is not an experience that we can relate to if you're not suffering from this condition. One way to understand what might be happening is to think of the reverse condition, which probably a lot of you will be familiar with, this concept of phantom limbs. So when people have had an amputation for some medical reason, say they've had an accident or an infection or some unfortunate reason, then some of them will say that after the amputation they still continue to feel the presence of the limb, right? And that feeling usually goes away, but for some people it persists well after the amputation is done. Now, and for some people they even have the unfortunate experience of feeling pain in a limb that no longer exists, right? So not only are they feeling the presence of a limb that has been amputated, they're actually feeling pain in that limb. So, and that's called phantom pain. Now you can start asking what's happening. The objective reality is that the limb is gone, but you're perceiving a leg which is not there, right? And the sort of dominant neurological explanation for this is what's happening is that the brain is constructing maps of the body. It's constructing maps and maintaining these maps all the time, moment by moment by moment. And when you have an amputation, a map just being the representation of the body. So in a way you can think of the brain as having a complete representation of the body in the format that it needs to have. We don't exactly know how it does it, but there are maps, and there are many different maps of the body in the brain. Now, when there is an amputation, then the thing that should happen is the internal map should reorganize to reflect the fact that the limb is no more, right? And that's usually what happens. But in certain cases, those maps don't reorganize. And what this is telling you is what you perceive as your body, right? What each one of us perceives as our body right now is actually that information content. It is not, I mean, of course that information has to be congruent with physical reality. Otherwise, we wouldn't be functioning as biological organisms. But in certain cases, things can go awry, and phantom limbs are one such case. And there's a neuropsychologist in Zurich that I talked to a lot who had an interesting way of looking at these two things as mirror problems of each other. He would call phantom limbs animation without incarnation, where the idea being that the limb is incarnated in your mind, but it's not actually, or rather animated in your mind, but it's not physically incarnated because it's gone. And BIID, he called it incarnation without animation. The physical incarnation of the limb is there, but for some reason it's not animated in your mind. What specifically is happening in BIID is you have lost sense of ownership of a body part, right? So now you can start thinking, we take the ownership of our body parts for granted, but it turns out that the ownership of body parts can come apart. So you can say there is an I that can experience the sense of ownership of a body part, and an I that can experience the sense of not owning a body part. Who or what is that I, right? Where does that I come about? So you kind of, in Alzheimer's we could kind of distance the I from the narrative self, because you can have an I that experiences a narrative and an I that experiences the lack of a narrative or a scrambled narrative. In BIID you can argue that there is an I that experiences the lack of ownership of a body part, just as otherwise we should be experiencing the ownership of a body part, right? So that I is there. Who or what is that I? So you can see how there's a certain method by which you can talk about these neurological conditions to start dismantling aspects of the sense of self, right? So, and the same kind of thinking can be applied to other conditions. I mean, I also want to point out, as I talk about this, is that when these conditions get serious, and they do many times, these are very, very hard things for the people suffering from it. So during the course of the writing of this book, for me it became really clear that we have to appreciate the fact that there's always a subject of an experience that is experiencing these conditions. And it's better to talk of someone with schizophrenia rather than saying someone is a schizophrenic. There's a subtle difference, and it really changes how we interact with each other when we appreciate that. And so taking schizophrenia, you can with schizophrenia, one of the things that happens for people suffering with schizophrenia is that they hear voices in their heads that don't feel like their own. A lot of people hear voices, but usually it's not debilitating because those voices still feel like your own. It just has an auditory quality. Some people don't hear any voices at all. We just have sort of thoughts, unbidden or willful thoughts in our heads, but sometimes there are voices, but at least those voices feel like your own. In schizophrenia, those voices take on an auditory quality, and they also don't feel like your own. They feel like someone else's, right? And similarly, thoughts, they have this sense that there are thoughts in their heads that don't feel like their own. Now, this is again, like if each one of us now thinks about the thoughts in our heads, there is an implicit quality of mindness. I think this is a term that Thomas likes a lot, the word mindness, the idea that something feels like mine, right? It has a quality of, you own that thought. And it's implicit. We don't have to think about it. That's the baseline feeling of a thought. In schizophrenia, unfortunately, that's not the case. You can have a thought that doesn't feel like your own. What does that mean? They have an altered sense of agency. So, for instance, no, I was just going to make a joke. Let's go back. Yeah, please. If I click if I click this clicker and the thing moves, I have the feeling that I did it, right? I have a sense of agency. If I pick up a glass of water and drink from it, implicit in that action is the feeling that I am the agent of that action, right? And people with schizophrenia, some people will have an altered sense of agency. They can do the same actions and it will not feel like they did it. So the question is, how does that come about, and what does that tell us about the sense of self or the I? People with schizophrenia also feel a kind of blurring between boundaries of the self and others, which can be a blurring of the bodily self boundaries or even the psychological narrative self boundaries. Let me just tell you briefly about how the altered sense of agency can be explained within neuropsychology and neuroscience. Remember that these are somewhat speculative, but there's also some evidence to back up these claims. And the altered sense of agency, for instance, if I were to pick up a glass of water, what the brain is doing is it's sending motor commands to the arm to pick up the glass of water. It's also sending the commands that it sends to the arm, to the muscles, to other parts of the brain. The other parts of the brain now predict the sensory consequences of picking up that glass of water. And if the predicted sensory consequences and the actual consequences of picking up that glass of water match up, there is an implicit tagging. I'm using these words loosely. We don't really know how these things happen in the brain, but generally in terms of a way of thinking about it, if the predicted consequences of the action and the actual sensory input that's coming in match up, the action that you did has the feeling of being done by the self or being attributed to the self. Now you can imagine somewhere in this chain of processing that goes a little bit off, right? So you do the action, but somehow it's not being referred back to, there's a mismatch. That mismatch is implicit. So if there's a mismatch between the predicted consequences of something and what actually happens, that is implicitly taken as non-self. Here, self just means that there is a match between the prediction and what actually happens. Non-self means there is a mismatch. So if, again, keep in mind these are models, speculations, backed up by some evidence, and it's a growing field of research. People are converging on this set of ideas. But there's one other simple thing we can do right now is just move your head back and forth, right? If you're moving your head back and forth, what's happening to the scene in front of you? No, keep looking also, right? The scene in front of you doesn't shift, right? Now you can argue that you can be just standing there and let the scene move in front of you. And as far as the information falling on your eyes, it'll be pretty much the same, right? If you're looking at that side of the room and you move your head and light from that side of the room falls on your head because you moved your head, versus you just stand there and let this room move around you, the same kind of information will fall on your eyes. How does the brain know that when I do this, it should keep the scene constant, whereas if I am standing still and the information is the same, then the room must be moving, right? It does so because of it can do so because of exactly the same mechanism. It's sending motor commands to the neck, right? You're moving your neck muscles, and these commands are also going to other parts of the brain, which are then predicting the sensory consequences of what will happen when information comes towards you, and it uses all of that information to make sure that the image is kept still. So it's not letting the image move because it knows that the movement is coming from the fact that you moved your neck muscles. So there's a lot of prediction going on about what should be coming at you from the outside, and it's using a lot of information from within to anticipate the sensory input that's coming at you. And some of these mechanisms go awry in schizophrenia, right? And just like I told you about the sense of agency, you can do an action and not feel like it's your own. Something similar seems to be at work with thoughts. A thought, when it happens, has to be attributed back to the self, or back to the, we get into trouble with language here. When I say attributed back to the self, that somehow implies there is a self. That's not what I'm trying to get at. It's implicit. When in this way of thinking, if you go back to the agency issue, when the prediction about what's going to happen and what actually happens matches up, that is implicitly self, because that's how the brain is functioning. And when there's a mismatch, in certain cases the mismatch is tagged as non-self. And maybe something similar is happening with thoughts in people with schizophrenia, that there is a problem with the tagging, and your thought suddenly feels as if it is not yours. Now you can start imagining the downstream consequences of these mechanistic disturbances, right? If you have a thought in your head that doesn't feel like your own, you are eventually going to start feeling paranoid. Psychosis can be also talked of in terms of prediction. So what is this telling you about the sense of agency and the self? There have been philosophers who have argued that the sense of the I, the sense of being an I to whom things happen, or the sense of being an I that does things, comes about because we are agents of actions. Schizophrenia is clearly showing you that no, you can be an I that feels no sense of agency, or you can be someone who feels a sense of agency. There is still a subjective experience of lack of sense of agency, right? So who or what is that I, right? Again, I'm not implying at this stage that there is an I. I'm just saying we're still asking the question, who or what is the I that is the subject of a certain kind of experience, right?
Isn't that just the capacity to integrate all the senses?
We'll come to that point, right? So keep that in mind, absolutely. So you can, how are we doing for time, yeah?
Good. 20 minutes.
20 more minutes?
More. Yeah.
More? All right, good. So you can start asking such questions about just about every aspect of yourself that you think is integral to your sense of self. Emotions, again, we are very tightly coupled. We don't feel any we are our emotions most of the time, right? By and large, the emotional state of my body is what I am. So when I say I am happy or I am angry, that's reflecting, that's a statement about my present sense of myself. Now, there are conditions like depersonalization disorder where people will say that they feel distant from their own emotions. There is a kind of disembodiment. They feel distant from their own physical body. They have a sense of unrealness about their self. They have a sense of unrealness about the environment. And they feel estranged. The phrase they commonly use is they feel like they're living as if in a dream. And they struggle with words to explain how it feels, but essentially it's some kind of disembodiment from which, if you're not feeling that, again, this is not something I can personally relate to, because my sense of myself at this point is one of being completely embodied in this body here and now. I don't feel any distance from my emotions, or I don't even know what those phrases mean, right? So until you experience that, it's very hard to understand what that might be like. But again, we have to take these experiences seriously. People who are living through these conditions, whose lived experience incorporates these kinds of situations, they have to be taken seriously, and they have to be explained as to why that might be happening. And I won't go into the details of what happens, but what depersonalization kind of tells you is that you can be an I that is fully embodied and fully kind of connected to your emotional, to the emotional aspects of yourself, or you can be an I that feels distant from the body, that feels distant from the emotions. So again, the same question, who or what is that I that is experiencing that disembodiment or that disconnect from the emotions, you know? So, and I deliberately use the phrase who or what is that I. Who implies there's a person, and what kind of makes that a little bit more ambiguous. You know, we don't quite know what that I is, right? So, and still, not to suggest that there is an I, this is just a question we are posing. And similarly, social self. Now, one of the conditions that really challenges notions of the I just being the consequence of our social selves is something like autism, right? One of the problems children with autism, people with autism have to deal with is that they struggle with relating to other people. There is their social selves, you know, because remember what William James said about what a social self is. A social self is any interaction that you're having in a social context kind of brings about a social self. So when you think about the social self like that, then children with autism, people with autism actually struggle with their social self. They have a really hard time relating to others, and part of that problem comes about because they struggle with ability that most of us have without even knowing it, and it's called the theory of mind, which is that I can look at some of you and infer that in your minds you're really, really bored and you would rather go have coffee or not, right? I'm just making a joke. Everyone looks very interested. So the point is that we have the ability to look at behavioral cues, body language, and kind of make inferences. We theorize about what's happening in someone else's mind. This is a way of saying we can peek into someone's mind and have a sense of what they are thinking. And it's not something we work at. It's not a cognitive task. It is, you know, just a perception that arises within us about what someone might. We could be wrong about what we are theorizing, but nonetheless, yes. Of course.
I just have a comment. So, what about, you know, emotions or experiences that we have, say family members, right? So you have the first child, second, third, fourth. Something happens, and each child interprets that experience or that interaction differently. They all have a different emotion. So, you know, you're going to some extreme about problems. This is like in every family that I know.
So that, and
right?
Absolutely, and that's the point that I think we should reiterate, that even though we are speaking about conditions that seem like extreme situations, each one of us in our lifetimes will be on this spectrum somewhere. Like we are going to, each one of us is going to experience some aspect of this. So we really shouldn't be thinking of these as disorders or pathologies. They do become difficult for people. There is real suffering involved, so we shouldn't also deny that. Like someone with serious autism or serious schizophrenia is suffering. So without denying that, we should also not pathologize, you know, make it a thing that you just push into one corner and bin it and categorize it.
Because my point was really, it's really like it's so pervasive, right? I mean, what I just communicated. So it's not even considered. I don't know if it's considered a disorder or extreme, but it can manifest itself very, very extremely over generations, you know. And so
it can, and especially something like theory of mind, this ability which I was telling you about, reading other people's minds. You know, there will be a spectrum of those abilities in this room, and potentially none of us will say, you know, we have a pathology, but there will be varying abilities of that in this room. Absolutely. So, and it's possible that there are certain accounts of what happens in autism. It might have to do with the fact that, you know, remember earlier we talked about how the brain is creating maps of the body, it creates models of the body. Now, why does the brain have to do that? And there are theories that say that if, you know, the brain is essentially, from an evolutionary perspective, our nervous system, our brain, is essentially a system that evolved to help the body navigate its environment, to survive, to procreate, find food, all of these things, right? And in order for it to do that well, it actually has to create models of the body within itself, and it has to create models of the environment. It has to basically have internal representations of the body and of the environment in order for the brain to do what it has to do, which is help the body survive and navigate. This is very clear in robotics. When you work with robotics, there are theorems there that actually say that this has to be the case. So given that the body makes models, and those models are what we perceive as our body, there is some evidence that in autism the brain is unable to come to a stable perception of the body, that in order for the models to be stable, it has to continually interact with the extremities of the body, the receptors we have in our muscles, our tendons, etc., that are giving the brain feedback about what the body is doing. And there's a lot of noise in that signal, in those signals that are coming back into the brain. So the brain is unable to build a stable perception of the body. So it's almost like everything that the body is encountering is always new to the brain. And when you view what's happening in autism in this way, some of the very, very varied symptoms start making sense. They are, children with autism can be hypersensitive to stimuli. They really don't like surprises. They really don't. They want predictability. And part of it is because of the fact that every stimulus that they encounter always feels like it's new. So they want to restrict this element of surprise. And theory of mind, when we talked of theory of mind, the ability to peek inside somebody else's mind, that is a form of prediction. And that depends on having, in a manner of speaking, a stable percept of your own body. And that's also a downstream consequence of not being embodied with a stable perception of the body. So what autism actually is telling us is that this idea that certain philosophers have had, that if you take away the social self, there is no I, it calls into question even that, right? I mean, here the social self is, well, depending on the severity of the condition, you can have very, very different social selves, and there is still an I that is experiencing all these different kinds of social self. Who or what is that I? Now, autism doesn't quite lend itself to this kind of analysis, but just to point out that if you take away the social self, it does not mean that there is no experiencer left, right? So the social self seems to be another construct that we can put on one side and say, hang on, there is still a simple subject of experience that we need to explain. Sorry. So hortoscopic phenomena, these are, a lot of people will be familiar with it. I think about 5% of the population over their lifetimes will have an out-of-body experience. I think that's what the literature says, if I'm not mistaken. 8 to 15 now? People have started reporting more and more. That's good. So 8 to 15. That's a large number. That's a sizable number. Again, I'm unfortunate not to have experienced. I don't know what that feels like. But so I'm not saying it's bad. So none of these things. We have to be very careful. There's no value judgment about what these are, right? So we have to be very careful about that. But the doppelganger effect. The doppelganger effect is something. I'll give you an anecdote. This unfortunately happened to my cousin's. I'm saying unfortunate because he died because of what happened. But he had a brain tumor, and he was basically struggling with the tumor, having seizures. And one day he was driving in New Delhi and had to pull over and call his mother, my cousin, and tell her, "Mom, I'm seeing myself in front of me." So he was experiencing a perception of another himself right in front of him in the car, and he was aware of this other himself's emotional state. And his mom calmed him down, and the hallucination went away, and then he drove to the neurologist. I don't know if he directly went to the doctor at that time or not, but unfortunately the tumor became severe that he passed away in his early 30s, very young. So, but this is something called the doppelganger effect. A lot of people will report it. There are accounts of this in literature. And the doppelganger effect can get even more complex, where you actually perceive another yourself And not only do you perceive another yourself just being there, but your sense of where you are can shift from the physical body, from being in the physical body, to being in the illusory body and looking at your physical body, right? So this brings us to certain things about what it means to be in body, right? We can talk about that. The outer body experiences are people will report that they have left their body and they are looking at their own lifeless body from some other vantage point. Normally our vantage point is literally from behind our eyes. We look at the world from behind our eyes. We don't look at the world from behind our knees or from our backsides. We look out at the world, but it's still embodied, right? We're still within the body, and an outer body experience is one where the perspective changes. You are somewhere else. You, whatever that you is somewhere else looking at the body, right? Now this really, what outer body experiences are really telling us is that we should start questioning why we feel in body to begin with. And this brings us to your integration of multiple sensations.
Some yogis we hear are able to do that voluntarily.
Yes, and there's a reason for that. We will come to that, right? So, so now we can start talking of what does it mean to be fully embodied, right? One of the attributes of feeling fully embodied is that I identify with this body, right? I have a sense of identification with this body which occupies a very specific volume of space, right? And if I move around, my sense of identification moves with the body. It's implicit. There shouldn't be any doubt in our minds about it. That's how we all feel. That's how I hope all of you are feeling, right? And the other thing is that we have a sense of sort of what we said earlier, a first-person perspective. We're looking out at the world from behind our eyes. And some of these attributes are what start coming apart in orthoscopic phenomena, right? And the reason why we feel embodied in the first place in the way we do is because there are many different parts of the brain that are involved in what's called multisensory integration. The brain is essentially taking in sensations from outside, sort of external sensations, and there are sensations coming from within the body, from our viscera, about the heartbeat, about blood pressure, all these other signals that we are not necessarily aware of. But it's putting all, and there are vestibular signals which has to do with balance. There's proprioception, right? If you close your eyes and move your arms, you have a clear sense of where your arms are. You don't have to look at them. But that's because there are receptors in our joints and that are telling the brain the relative position of our body parts in 3D space, and it's constantly constructing these body maps and keeping it up to date based on what information it's coming in. We won't get into how these perceptions form because that's a separate issue, but let's say that a perception is forming about the body, and it involves this multisensory integration. Now, there are certain centers in the brain where if this multisensory integration gets disrupted, you can have the consequences that I just mentioned. You can have something like the Dopal Ganga effect, or you can have an outer body experience. So you can replicate these in labs. So for instance, when people are undergoing exploratory surgery for epilepsy, right? Epilepsy, which is normally drug resistant and really not responding to treatment, surgeons have to go into the brain and start stimulating different parts of the brain to figure out where the focus of this epilepsy is. It's a procedure that's rare but necessary for some patients, and often these patients volunteer to have their brain stimulated when they're conscious, because the surgeon has opened up the skull and has electrodes placed in the brain, and they volunteer to have their brain stimulated for the sake of science. And a lot of what we have learned about what happens in the brain comes from these studies. And one of the studies, I think one of Thomas's collaborators, Olaf Blanke in Switzerland, did this study where they were able to stimulate a very particular region of this brain and figure out that when that was done, you could induce an out-of-body experience repeatedly, right? So something about the way information is integrated in that particular region of the brain was getting disrupted, causing the out-of-body experience. The Dopal Ganga effect has been correlated with lesions in the insular cortex, which is another region of the brain where a lot of this integration happens, right? So the takeaway here with orthoscopic phenomena is that when multisensory integration in the brain kind of gets disrupted, you can have dislocations of our sense of being an embodied self. And The other stronger message is that the sense of being an embodied itself is a construction. It's something that the brain has to do moment by moment by moment, which is why when you move around, you don't feel like you have left your eye behind there and the body is going away. No, right? The calculations that the brain is doing moment by moment has to keep up with whatever you're doing, right? And it's the geometric frame of reference is your body. It situates the eye. Again, we don't know what that eye is. It situates the eye behind your eyes, right? So that's a construction. And so you can now see that there are all of these things are coming apart. All these things that we took for granted as if they are monolithic and that they are substantial can either be played around with in the lab or in unfortunate situations people end up with having to deal with the consequences of these disruptions. But nonetheless, all of these things are telling us that what we have to explain is what is the subject of these experiences. What is the I that is experiencing all of these conditions or none of these conditions? There's always an I, right? We haven't got an answer for that yet. And there's a spoiler alert. There is no answer. I'm just going to lay out the questions. It's not like that. So, and this ecstatic epilepsy is one of the most intriguing conditions that I read about, and when I talked to the people who have experienced it, it was. So here's a list of the things that they say they feel when they are in the throes of a seizure, right? And this is ecstatic epilepsy is what's called a focal seizure, which means that the seizure is restricted to a small part of the brain. It doesn't spread. Like if a seizure were to spread and overwhelm the entire brain or the cortex, you would go unconscious, and that would be a grand mal seizure. But a focal seizure is restricted. In this particular case, it's restricted to a particular region of the brain. And read that list, and it says they feel a very heightened perception of their own body and of the environment. So they're very conscious of, there's a real vividness to their perception of their own body and body states and of the environment. There's a certain feeling of bliss, mental well-being and physical well-being. There's a feeling of time slowing down. There's a feeling of certainty. The way they say is that when they are having a seizure, the perception of the world around them feels there's a certain certitude about it. Everything is as it should be, that nothing is out of place, right? And they also have, paradoxically, and I say paradoxically because the first item in that says they have a very heightened perception of their body. So in a sense, they're very conscious of a certain aspect of their sense of self, the bodily self. But paradoxically, there's also some loss of boundary. They feel one with, that's how they put it, depending on who you speak to. The general way of sort of summarizing that is they feel like certain boundaries have disappeared. Yeah.
Many of these feelings people get from either yoga or from Tai Chi or from meditation. I wonder if there's any research that shows that in this ecstatic epilepsy, those parts of the brain that are triggered are also those parts of the brain that are triggered in meditation yoga.
There is. So not conclusive, but there is. I'll come to that. And what's happening here is that generally ecstatic epilepsy had been thought of as a seizure in the temporal lobe. It used to be called temporal lobe epilepsy, and over the last 4 or 5 years, some neurologists have started pinning down exactly where it happens, and they have homed in on something called the left anterior insula. It's the insular cortex, which is, remember I just told you that the Dopal Ganga effect has to do with lesions in the insular cortex, which is where a lot of the integration of sensations, both external sensations and internal sensations happens. Ecstatic epilepsy seems to be caused by a seizure in that area. And the general idea of why, here's one explanation for some of these things, is that the seizure is essentially heightening all those processes that are normally involved in giving you a sensation of your own body at any given time, right? At every moment in time, we are aware of a certain emotional state of our body, and there's a perception of it, whether it's sharp, less sharp, vivid, dull, whatever, but you're always aware of a certain state of your body. Now, ecstatic epilepsy just heightens that, and if the region that is seeing more activity is the very region that is normally giving you a certain sensation of your body, then the argument is that just hyperactivity in that region is creating more of that sensation. What is interesting is, why is there this paradoxical blurring of boundaries with something, self boundaries, so that you feel one with something larger? What might be happening? The explanation there is that much of the brain's resources are really going into heightening awareness of the body and the sensations. And in a manner of speaking, it's taking away resources from the narrative self, the other self that we have, which is constantly doing this mental time travel, which is a part of our being too. You can't avoid it. And so for that moment in time, for those 1 or 2 seconds, which actually to them feels like 30 minutes or an hour sometimes, and there are explanations for that too as to why that might happen. But basically, it seems to be that at that moment in time, the perception of the self is fully on, the body, and the narrative components are relatively shut down. And you were talking about meditation, yoga. Well, in a sense, mindfulness is, that's sort of what it does. There have been scanning studies done of meditators that seems to suggest similar brain areas, but the more relevant studies come from scanning studies of people who have taken psychedelics, which also engender similar perceptions, and you're seeing some correlations. We have to really be cautious when you do an fMRI of a brain. You are looking at a snapshot of a brain at one moment in time. It does not tell you the history of that brain. It does not tell you about all the things that happened to that brain over 40 years. It's just telling you this is what is happening. And it's also a correlation. It's correlating signals in the brain to a phenomenological experience. It's not saying that's causing this, right? So interpretations, you have to be really careful when you look at fMRI studies or scanning studies and saying, oh, this is the cause of this, right? These are correlations. Causation is a very different and very difficult thing to establish. But again, ecstatic epilepsy actually is telling you that your sense of self normally, which includes sense of the bodily self and the sense of the narrative self, you can't quite separate them. They're just happening, kind of all the time. And somehow it just focuses all of the resources into one, and relatively speaking, shuts down the other part. You can end up in other situations where you are totally involved in self-obsessed thoughts, where you're really, really completely immersed in your narrative self and have become unaware of the body. You can go the other way also. And there's some evidence that, well, I'll come to that. Next slide, we'll get to that. So this is a condition that really challenges us. If I ask each one of you, do you exist? Your answer will hopefully be yes, I exist, right? There's really no doubt. It's one of those implicit things that we don't question, but there are people who will, when they're in the throes of this syndrome, which is called Courthouse Syndrome, will say, I don't exist, right? Or I'm dead, or they will have certain definitions of how they are dead. And again, this is a very severe form of depression. So there's a psychiatrist in France that I talked to who treats people with Courthouse, who explained to me just how depressed people with Courthouse can be. And he drew a line diagram for me. On one side he said, this is how you normally feel, and then there is sadness, and there's melancholy, and there's depression, all of it kind of a linear progression of moods. And then he drew a series of dots saying, okay, now the progression gets non-linear, and suddenly on this side there's Courthouse. Like, you can't even imagine what it must be like to be suffering from Courthouse syndrome in terms of how they feel about themselves. So there have been very few studies of people with Courthouse in terms of brain scanning results, but there have been a couple in the last few years, and both of them are fairly revealing. It turns out that there are sort of two competing networks in the brain. One which is responsible for external awareness of things, coming at us from the outside, and there's one network that is called the internal awareness network, which is responsible for essentially awareness of internal body states, self-related thoughts, things, mind wandering, daydreaming. All of those things are part of this internal awareness network. And in Courthouse, at least in this one person, this is one case study, so we have to interpret this very cautiously. The activity, the metabolic activity in the internal awareness network was damped down dramatically. And the comparison was the neurologist who did the scanning is someone who also works with patients in coma. So he said that in this patient with Courthouse, the metabolic activity in this internal awareness network was the same as the kind of activity you would see in a person who is called, who's said to be in a state of wakeful awareness? No, I forget. It used to be called the vegetative state. Thomas, do you know what the new term is? Not minimally conscious. There's something wakefulness. Not coma is the extreme, but there's another state. It used to be called the vegetative state. I'll come back to that. Unresponsive wakefulness. Yeah, sorry, that's what it is. Unresponsive wakefulness. So, and this activity was comparable to what was, what's normally seen in people along the scale of being in coma. And but there was also another damage that this person had, which was damage to the lateral frontal lobes, which are normally involved in rational thought. And the explanation from the neurologist who treated this man is that, well, what's happening here is that the damage to the internal awareness network, or the lowered metabolic activity in that particular network, which is responsible for internal awareness of your own state, is so sort of depressed, or dampened is the right word, that there is a perception arising in that person that I don't exist. Because existence normally we attribute, again implicitly, we take it to be the way we all feel. There's a certain vividness to our embodiment. There's a certain vividness to our emotion, our perceptions of our emotional states. So when that perception just kind of the bottom fell out of that, it was the idea is that the perception that arose in that person was that of I don't exist, and because of also simultaneous damage to centers of the brain that might have rationally helped the person talk himself out of it, he was unable to do that either. So it's like the example that neurologist gave me was, if you're walking down the street and you see from just a little bit in front of you someone who looks like your friend, the immediate perception that arises in you is, oh, that's my friend. But then instantly there is a cognitive component that comes in saying, oh, but I know my friend is not in town, so that can't be my friend. So you're able to use rational thought to negate a perception that arose within you. In this case, the person's abilities to rationally sort of argue himself out of this kind of perception that I don't exist was also sort of problematic. So he couldn't do, and this kind of two-factor explanation also could be used to explain what another scanning study showed, but these are very limited studies. The point I want to make about Courthouse syndrome is, again, notion of an I. So, all of us can say I exist, but someone with Courthouse will say I don't exist. Who or what is that I that's saying that? So the question remains at the end that we still have to explain where that subjectivity of experience, where does the subject of an experience come from, right? And that ultimately, can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So explaining the I. Now, so you see now that.
Just one
yeah.
thing. Would you like to have because you might have a few slides left.
Just a couple. Two.
Okay. So do you want to finish it, or do you want to say, hey, that's what I'm starting with, and then you go into questionings with that?
Let me just finish the two slides, and then it'll lead into
good.
Yeah, it'll be easier. So basically, the idea is for all of us who are trying to understand, what philosophers, what neuroscientists, what theologians are arguing about in terms of the nature of the self, they are really trying to get at the nature of subjectivity. How does the subject of an experience arise? The notions of the narrative self, the social self, the sense of being a body, all of these things, it's very, very clear from the science, from the philosophy, and from the perspective of many theologians, is that those are constructions and an illusion in that sense, right? We're not saying there is someone perceiving that illusion, but these are all constructions without a constructor. There's no one explicitly sitting there constructing these things. But the question we have to really ask, that in each of these conditions, only one aspect of the self was kind of disrupted. Now, how would we be able to talk about a person in whom, say, the self had 20 different aspects, sum total, just hypothetically, and if all 20 were to be disrupted, would there still be a sense of an I, the subject? We can't answer that question. I don't know of any psychiatric, psychological, neuropsychological condition where that happens. I think, Thomas, you had once said that there might be some condition that comes close to that, no?
Comes close to what?
Where you, all of these attributes, I don't think there is, right?
Integration goes Ori.
Yeah, but only bits and pieces go Ori. That's the thing, right? We're in each of these conditions, we are saying that, aspects of the self are coming apart, but other aspects are still there, right? Sorry? Yes, but yes, he's saying I am dead, but that's the Courthouse person is saying I am dead, and he's still using the word I to say it, but he's still aware of his body. There's a certain he's not at all dysfunctional in a way that somebody dead would be. He's actually, like in the case of the person that they interviewed the neurologist about, he was planning his funeral. He would go to he would go to graveyards and sit there because he felt more akin to people in graveyards than he did away from that. There was a loss of appetite for food, and for instance, he used to smoke, but when he was in the throes of Courthouse, smoking didn't have the same sensation, but he would still smoke. He would still eat, drink, and every sleep, but somehow the kind of vividness with which we perceive our appetites, our emotions was missing, and that led to the perception of non-existence, which also he was unable, you couldn't argue logically with him about it, right? His neurologist would sit in front of him and say, I guess we are slipping into questions anyway, so is that okay? All right. So his neurologist would tell him, look, you can hear me speak, you can understand me, your mind is alive, and he would say, yes, I can hear you speak, I can understand you, yes, my mind is alive. And then the neurologist would say, well, that must mean that your brain is fine. And he would say, no, my brain is dead. He had a very particular notion of death. He said he was brain dead, right? And he would refuse to accept the fact that he was not brain dead. And there was no argument. So we can't have a rational argument about that perception that that person is having. That person is not willing to participate in a rational argument. So for us from the outside in, it's impossible to know what that might feel like, right? So anyway, so finally, all the theorists, all the people who are wondering about the nature of the self, are really trying to explain the nature of this subjectivity. Like, what is the I that says I don't exist, or what is the I that has an outer body experience, or what? Where does that come from? Where does that subjectivity come from? Where does that feeling come from that there is an I, right? And the struggle is not to explain the narrative self, or the struggle is not to explain the social self, because those are, they are problems in terms of figuring out how they get constructed and how the mechanisms work and all that. But the real sort of philosophical and neuroscientific problem is, where does the subjectivity come from? So the bundle theorists, like David Hume, most Buddhists would agree with David Hume, is that all we are is a bundle of perceptions, or as the Buddhists would say, we are a collection of psychophysical elements, and you take that away and there is nothing. You can't find that center. The center arises, the appearance of a center comes about because of a bundle of perceptions, or the interaction of psychophysical elements, etc. So they're basically saying there is no self, and there is no self in the ontological sense, that there is nothing that is separate from the material body that you and I are, that when that material body goes away, there's no substance remaining that can be called the self. And I did not meet any philosopher or theorist who would say that there is a self in the ontological sense. That's pretty much accepted now. No one is arguing for giving the self an ontological status. There are, really? Like, they are taken seriously?
Very good ones.
They're taken seriously?
Yes, and there are Christian philosophers, for instance.
But from a neuroscientific perspective?
No.
No. Okay. So sorry. That's I should have made that clear. Yes, Krishna.
Yeah. You also studied Krishnamurti, so can...
I should beg off. I don't want to
Or
say
his
that I understand.
biography you read.
I have read his biography.
So can all this explain
what is called the process, which is a bit of a mystery for all of us, what went through that body. I mean, he had these out-of-body experiences. He would leave his body and venture out.
I mean,
and there are descriptions of the process thing. So it would be interesting to know if we can explain that in some way, as some form of it.
You can imagine that it's a very, very touchy subject, right? It's a very touchy topic, right? Because no, I mean, look, it's in history there are historical accounts of how mystics are probably experiencing a form of ecstatic epilepsy, right? So those allusions are there. People have made those statements. There are, I think Olaf Blanke has written a paper about why revelations always happen on mountaintops. So, right? Sorry.
Is that he said that a deep psychological insight can actually cause mutation in brain cells, but by that he meant change these neurological.
I don't deny. I mean, so sorry.
No, just the format, because I mean we said we had announced that we would first have your talk, and then we would do questions and answers, because then also we get the microphone, because there are people also watching. So I think the best thing is to just have a break, so everybody can also go to the restroom, have a cup of tea. So
okay, let me just finish the last bullet point.
Okay. So hold your question, and then we go there. Yeah.
So there are self theorists who will argue that there must be some mental construction in the brain that comes about first, which acts as a placeholder for the self. I'm just using very loose language now, you'll have to pardon me. And then every experience is then attributed to that mental construct, right? So somebody like Dan Zahavi would say that there needs to be some idea of a minimal self that comes about. He's not arguing for an ontological self, but something that is still constructed in the brain, but first, and then everything else is referred to that. And there are people who will say that self is just consciousness, that every moment of consciousness has a property of reflexivity, that it is aware of itself, not that there is a person or somebody, that every moment of, and then it's a question of stringing together moments of consciousness into the larger self that we experience ourselves as. That takes us into a completely different question about whether consciousness is real, whether that is an illusion, whether it's immaterial, whether it's just a material thing, etc., etc. But this is the lay of the land. So what I wanted to set out was just that this is where the argument is happening about the nature of the subjectivity. When people talk of an I, they're not talking of all these other things that we normally attribute to the sense of self, but just about where does this subjectivity come from. And it would be fair to say that the jury is still out on that, right? Okay, so thank you.
Okay, we have half an hour break. Stream, so there's several people watching the stream. And maybe I can start with one of the questions from the stream. Everybody's sitting. You want to read it, because it's so dense that I.
That's on. That's on. Yeah, okay. So there's a question which says, from Rafael Gonzalez Hidalgo, does the sense of self imply a form of consciousness? Is there consciousness without the sense of self? So you recall the last slide kind of, I said that some people think that the subjectivity, the sense of being an experiencer or being a subject. Oh, sorry, that's also another mystery. Where did those shoes come from? So that's where the shoes come from. It's not my shoes. So some philosophers will say that the subjectivity is an inherent property of a moment of consciousness. Now, it's very unclear, when we start talking of consciousness, we get into real murky waters, because there are, first of all, is consciousness something immaterial, right? Does consciousness arise out of the workings of the brain? Now, if I might have a personal opinion about it, but so will many other people, and there's a certain amount of science that supports a way of thinking about consciousness. There's rigorous philosophy that supports a certain way of thinking about consciousness, and there are different philosophers who will argue endlessly about this. But so, is consciousness immaterial? Is consciousness as material as our brain and body? Is consciousness an illusion, in the sense that, and that phrase needs some elaboration. All of us intuitively have this feeling that our mind, our conscious awareness, is something immaterial, that it is not it is not the same thing as the body. That's just how it feels internally to us. Let me finish this thought. Yeah? When philosophers say that consciousness is an illusion, what they're saying is that there is nothing immaterial out there that can be called consciousness. What we have to explain is, why does the illusion of immateriality come about, right? We do have that illusion of immateriality. We can't, or we have the perception internally, it feels to us that our mind is, somewhere out there. How does one account for that? So that's a valid problem, and so does the sense of self require consciousness? If consciousness, according to some people, if it is something real, and if it has the inherent property of reflexivity, that every moment of consciousness is aware of itself, then yeah, you can argue that the self is a moment of consciousness. That's one way of looking at it. What was the other question? Like, what other part of that question? I guess in general, when you come down to the notion of subjectivity, when you're trying to explain, this sense of an I, you can't.
Is there a consciousness without the sense of self?
We don't know, to be honest, because if there is no I, then who or what is going to come back and report saying it was conscious? I don't know how to answer that, and I doubt we'll have to ask. I could ask Thomas about that question. Is there consciousness without a sense of self?
So there's. So there's something I have recently dubbed the refrigerator light problem. We all know that the light goes out if we close the refrigerator.
But we don't know.
But then you always want to look if it really went out.
Right.
And the deeper problem behind this is not to confuse the fact that you cannot imagine something with conceptual necessity. For beings like us, it is impossible to imagine a selfless state of consciousness, because the very act of trying to actively simulating this in your mind brings about exactly the sense of effort that brings that sense of self with it.
Right.
So you cannot open the refrigerator without turning the light on. This doesn't mean that conceptually the light is on in the refrigerator. So there are things that will always remain completely counterintuitive to beings like us, but they might well be logically possible.
Okay, there you go. That's the answer. A very precise answer. Take the mic for the people.
I mean, for this topic, wouldn't we first need to, or the question, wouldn't we first need to understand what are we talking about when we say consciousness? What is the definition of that?
Because I think we all might have a different opinion of
Yeah,
what consciousness really means to
and
us.
we could have an entire conference on just defining consciousness. So I'm not sure this is the forum for that, honestly, because but there is consciousness in at least in the current sort of philosophical circles and neuroscience, that at every moment it is like to be something, right? There is a certain quality to whatever it is that one is experiencing, and it's that quality is attributed to consciousness. Again, people will have different ways of coming at it, and people will have different definitions of what that means, and we could just go off on lots of different tangents here. So let's leave that aside, honestly, because we have to start arguing about also whether consciousness is something immaterial or not, and that leads us down another path of. I think it's best we, at least from my perspective, in the book also, I kept away from that because of that, because that's a completely loaded, separate subject that needs its own rigor in definition and logical thinking to figure out what we are going on about.
Can I just make a point?
Yes, please. Apparently with the microphone.
Krishnamurti has talked about thought as material.
Mm-hmm.
So that needs to be brought out, explicated here, because we are dealing with subject that is a mixes of these two, thought,
right.
Matter, consciousness, and all that. What is your response?
I think thought is material. Thought is, the way I look at it, thought is, I agree with Krishnamurti completely, it is nothing more than a certain pattern of neural activity, which is a material thing. Now, there can be certain patterns of neural activity that enter conscious awareness, and certain patterns of neural activity that don't enter conscious awareness, right? There's a lots of things happening in our brains which are patterns of neural activity that we are not conscious of, and we may never be conscious of, right? So, but certain things do enter conscious awareness, and those are in some sense thoughts. Now, they are material, very much. That brings us to the phrase conscious awareness, and we come back to that sort of whole thing full circle, like what is conscious awareness? Now, is that material? Personally, I would say even that is just a material thing. There is nothing, extra going on. But that's where the argument lies with consciousness research. It's literally at that point where we are saying, is the brain creating something that is immaterial? And if so, what is how does it do that? What is the nature of this thing that is immaterial with the material brain? And you run into loads of problems at that point. But if you just think of thought as every thought is a certain pattern of neural activity, it is material, nothing else.
Yeah, but you see, I'm thinking in relation to K teachings, and that's why I'm raising this question.
Sure.
In what way will the knowledge of neurology or neurophysiology relevant to my investigation, self-inquiry? If I may ask you, it's a naive question, but we will go into it in a more careful fashion, but certainly it's worth asking, I think, at this point. What is the relevance of neuropsychology or whatever it is to the investigation of my consciousness, which is full of disorder, messy, and all that, as I see it?
Why do you say it's full of disorder and mess?
Because it's in conflict. It's completely lost in conflict, projections, endlessly. Look at the world in which we live. So many nationalities. So I'm talking.
So these arguments, I think, when one is talking of a thought as a material thing, as a neural activity, we're talking of things at a very mechanistic level of functioning. By the time we come to talking about cultures and people's ideas, religions, ideologies, we're talking of a complexity of the complexes of thoughts.
I agree
that
with that.
That is very, very hard to start sort of, so each system needs to be understood at the level at which it's happening, right? If you can't sort of take a clash of ideologies and somehow reduce that to a clash of neural patterns.
Yes, but
right?
That's what Western scientific methodology is trying to do.
No, I
trying to reductionistic.
No. I think there's a misunderstanding of reductionism.
That may be, but that needs to be discussed.
Let's
at least this is one of the most.
It is a pressing.
Criticism.
Yeah, no, I agree. So we should not mistake the attempt to understand how something like our brain functions with the. I don't think any neuroscientist would say that just because we think of thought as a pattern of neural activity, that they can then explain the complexity of human thought. Right? There are interactions of human thought that are happening at a level of complexity. When we talk of culture is finally, when you think about what, again, this is a slightly simplistic way of saying this, but if you think of culture as a set of ideas, right? Now, say Krishnamurti wrote 100 books and they're in the archive here. It would have no meaning for me until I read the book or someone told me about what Krishnamurti said, etc. Right? That information that he had put out, which is part of our culture, has to be communicated to me. The moment it gets communicated to me, it becomes a pattern of neural vibration in my brain. It has become a material thing in my brain. There is an instantiation of an idea in this material body, right? So culture is essentially a set of ideas that are sort of, engaged. You can view that as patterns of neural activity in a set of nervous systems. Now,
but what is the advantage of that? That's what I want to find out.
The advantage, no, I'm not sure there is an advantage to thinking about it like that. What I wanted to say was we shouldn't negate the attempt to understand these things at a mechanistic level by saying that, oh, that's reduction. These things need to be understood, but we also need to understand how cultures and thought patterns intersect and interact at a level of complexity that is different from this, right? So, and there are attempts to do that also. That's also science, but of a different kind, right? Of a different system, not of a different kind, but of a different system. Right? In physics, you can study quantum mechanics, right, which is the movement of minute particles at a very, very small level. But that same quantum mechanics can then be shown to explain the emergence of extremely complex systems, right? But you can't really, once the complex system has emerged, the physics that explains that complex system cannot be studied using quantum mechanics. It has a separate physics. So like fluids, right? If there's any fluid mechanics physics person out here will tell you that the physics that describes fluid mechanics is extremely complex. You have to study it at the level of the fluid. You can't, even though it can in principle and conceptually be reduced down to quantum mechanics, you cannot use quantum mechanics like in one. So it's the same way. So even though you can reduce all of culture to sort of patterns of neural activity, you cannot study culture by saying.
So in other words, I end up, as I understand it, in getting neurophysiological patterns, I'm impoverishing my whole experience, my whole life, as I see it, because it's an impoverishment in every sense of the term.
Well, why do you feel that?
I say that because there is no richness to that. It has been reduced to something else.
No, you have to look. So here's the thing. I think you have to look at it the other way. Instead of saying that all of your richness is being reduced to neural activity, you have to start thinking about how the richness has emerged from that neural activity. Those are two different things, right? If you start thinking about how this amazing brain, it's the most complex system in the universe. We have really no idea how complex it is. That complexity of neural activity.
I'm ignorant of that. Yes.
Right. Please. That complexity of neural activity has given rise to this richness. The richness has emerged from that. No. Once the emergence happens, the systems you need to study the emergent behavior and the physics or the science you need to study that are very different from the ones that a neurologist or a neuroscientist sitting with individual electrodes looking at one neuron will be able to help you with. So I don't look at it as it's been reduced to the level of neural activity. I look at it the other way, right? It's like, oh, this amazing complexity of the neural system has given rise to this incredible richness of human culture.
Why don't we leave it as it is and look at it fully? You see, Kay also has said, it's only when you observe directly can you see what is happening. The richness will reveal. For example,
so can I give you a...
Let me complete this.
Okay.
So I've got my consciousness is going through so many twists and changes and all that. It's just amazing, all the complexes that arise. But if I don't look at it, I will never find out that it is rich, full of possibilities. And unfortunately, whenever we look at it, we have 100 different interpretations and we already change it. But with this neurophysiology, we are even doing more of that kind of thing. That's why I'm raising this question.
I mean, your objection is, I can understand the impulse where it feels like, looking at the world through these mechanistic explanations somehow diminishes what we are, right? Now, I don't personally feel that way at all, because to me, understanding the mechanisms of... Remember that the thing that's understanding the mechanisms is also the very thing that Kay is asking us to look at ourselves. We are the ones who are understanding these things. This is not separate from the whole, right? If you are talking of looking at the whole, well, the scientific enterprise is part of the whole. You can't take that out and say, right? So, given that, for me, the wonder is just the emergence of this complexity. And yes, understand it at any level you choose to. I would not tell someone who is a psychologist who is understanding, behavior at the level of that psychologists do, to say, oh, ignore that, look at neurons. At the same time, I wouldn't tell a neuroscientist who's looking at a single neuron saying, oh, please don't do that, you should look at the brain as a whole. They're all doing what they're doing. And somewhere it's all part of the whole. And it's up to us to take all that knowledge and integrate it and figure out, right? So to come back to what you were saying, if our intent is to look at ourselves and look at what we perceive and try to make sense of it, right? Now take somebody who is... can we change the book thing? That makes me uncomfortable. Yeah. Okay, go back to the previous slide, Jaime. Yeah, leave it there. We'll come back to that. One of the things that is worth thinking about with these neuropsychological conditions is that when we say that I am going to look at something and make sense of it without understanding why that might be happening, but just some unknown notion of looking. I don't even know what that means, but let's assume that there is a way in which we can look that would reveal some. Now, I would ask you, if you were suffering from schizophrenia and you were hearing voices and you had psychosis, which is an altered sense of reality, right? Where your reality that you perceive internally does not correspond, is not congruent with external reality, what would you tell that person, right? That person might say, this is my whole. How would you dispute their truth at that point, right? So if you, like for instance, the person will say, I can see you standing there and you are actually standing behind, and saying, no, I'm behind you, I'm not in front of you. Your objective reality, and you can use scientific instruments, measure the fact that you're actually behind, but something about that person's perception is indisputably telling him or her that you are somewhere else. That is their truth. Now, you can argue from the outside that that's not the objective truth and they should refine their notion of reality. We can argue that each one of us should be suspicious of our own reality. Each one of us. And actually it turns out that the current work about perceptions is suggesting that that actually is very true. Each one of us is just essentially predicting what's out there. We are kind of, to use words that Thomas has used in his writings, we are always hallucinating about what's out there. That hallucination hopefully is congruent with objective reality and we can function as biological beings. But to know whether that is really true, I don't know how we can tell anyone that mine is better than yours, or who is the one.
I think that is a major fallacy in our lives. That is, we think I am comparing myself with him.
Yeah, Thomas, you want to say something?
So before I say something about cultural context and conscious experience, what I find helpful about widening the investigation by taking facts like these into account is that one sees that many things, if you just go the trodden paths of K terminology, look like personal things, actually are grounded in subpersonal events. For instance, I remember during the talks, I very often heard him say things about searching for emotional security in a world where there just is no security in human relations. Now, if you look at the latest models of brain functioning, they tell you that all the brain does, all the time, automatically, is reducing uncertainty and trying, in a situation where it's constantly disturbed, perturbed, to settle into a stable state. So this is not our fault. It's not that we as persons are stupid and always try to find an emotionally secure state in relationships, although we intellectually know this can never work. It's different. We are this process of uncertainty reduction, and it's not our fault in a certain sense. And there are many other examples, I think, where this subpersonal way of looking at things can help us to get a richer understanding. For instance, you mentioned conflict in me. When I listened to Kay, it always sounded to me like, yeah, there are these many little nasty egos in me, and I have conflict in my mind, and that's actually a problem, and probably it's a little immoral also to be so full of conflict. But if you look at scientific facts, you see that it is inherently competitive. It's ugly, it's sobering, perhaps, but it's like evolution is happening in your very brain. There are multiple subsystems competing, and you cannot change it all the time. So this is another way of looking at what it means that there is constant conflict in the mind, But that was just a footnote. So I thought it was very helpful that you gave us all these examples of different forms of self-experience. But I thought that for many of these examples, you can imagine a context where they would look like deep spiritual experiences, actually, depending on the context. Just think of the Alzheimer, the first example. If somebody came along, beaming and would just say, I'm constantly living in the present. I've let go of my life narrative. I don't even remember my past. In some circles, they would diagnose you for Alzheimer and pump you up with stuff. In other cultural contexts, they may put down flowers in front of your feet and ask, can they be your disciple?
Yeah.
Think about people who say, I am completely detached from this physical body. It's almost unreal. In some cultural contexts, you would count as an advanced practitioner of something. In others, you would go right into a closed ward in psychiatry. Most extremely, of course, with Courthouse Syndrome.
Yeah.
In Germany, there are now neo-Advaitans who make conferences like these, in which 30 people at the same time claim that they are awakened and fully enlightened. And they all claim that they do not exist and never have, and that enlightenment has happened to no one. In this completely insane social...
Times immemorial, people have had conflict.
Sorry?
Tried to solve the conflict.
Okay, so I'm just...
Hang on.
I'm just saying, in some contexts, this will appear as something for psychiatry, and in others, it will appear as a deep, advanced spiritual state for some people. And this does not touch the question of, is it knowledge or not? That's what I would also like to discuss with you. There could be some people who, by all of your criteria, would actually count as pathological cases. And the world could be like that, even this being so, these people have deep insight. They have a window into reality that normal people don't have. On the other hand, you could have people coming out of, so to speak, sane contexts in a Tibetan monastery, having practiced for decades, and it could be utter illusion and no form of knowledge. The isomorphic state of consciousness. So to find out if there's actually knowledge or insight somehow demands an independent justification, I think. And,
fair enough. I think somewhere during the talk we tried to make the point that I really don't want to think of the conditions that I describe as pathologies, right? That really is specific to how a culture deals with a certain way of being. So take the example of schizophrenia. It's the incidence of people having psychosis or hearing voices is pretty consistent across cultures. It's about 1 to 2% of the population. But the outcome of schizophrenia in terms of what happens to the person who is hearing voices or is having psychosis is culture dependent. So in the West, specifically in the US, you will get medicated, you will be, essentially, it's quite debilitating after that. But there are studies done which show that in Africa, in India, again, India, we have to be careful. Urban India is very different from rural India. But I would imagine the same is true for Africa, but certain places in India and Africa, the outcome of schizophrenia is very different because the person who is hearing voices is thought of as someone who's hearing voices from God. So the way the person who's hearing voices reacts to that person's cultural self now is very different, right? That person's cultural self, the way the subsequent sort of what happens after the psychosis sets in is fundamentally different in a culture which says you're mad versus a culture which is saying you are in touch with God, right? So, and that's something to keep in mind. So I completely agree with Thomas that these are not to be treated as pathologies. These were just, that's why I said in the beginning, I said just conditions. To tell you an anecdote, when I first proposed this book to my publisher, the subtitle was "What Mental Illnesses Are Telling Us About the Self." And by the time I finished my research, by the time I finished talking to various people who were so kind to tell me about their personal experiences of hearing voices or having ecstatic epilepsy, I could not think of these conditions as illnesses. They are just what they are. And it's the people on the outside looking in who are making claims about what that person is about. And then there's the larger sort of unanswered question about what knowledge are they privy to in these other ways of being. I don't have personally an answer for that, but it's something to keep in mind, absolutely.
When Thomas was speaking, the question arose about the subjective sense of suffering in the context of, in one circle this would be a mystic experience, in another this would have someone have the consequence of being institutionalized.
Right.
And then I was wondering about that being external context, but also a sense of an internal context. And where do we even learn a baseline of what it means to suffer? Is that something learned? So if my culture tells me if I deviate from the norm, I will suffer, and I experience things outside of what my culture tells me is normal, is that suffering then engendered by my relative, relationship to self and other, or, my culture? And so, but I wouldn't want to minimalize the intensity of living in a state where things were often talking to me and asking me to harm myself. So I wouldn't want to romanticize that, but I would also want to embrace some concept of that being, not pathology, but just curiosity or something.
I mean, there are so many things that you said, and I would like actually for Thomas to take some of those questions. But one thing I wanted to say is that the last thing you said, that we also have to be careful not to romanticize this. There are people, when their selves are so perturbed, that they will actually harm themselves, that they will cut them. Now, it's very hard to disentangle whether that's an act of something organic or something that is driven by the culture they're in. The point is, at that point, they are suffering. And, and you have to understand that, right? We have to accept that that should not be just romanticized and said, oh, they're, hearing voices from God. I mean, there are extremes even within this distribution of ways of being that we have to be aware of, that it might be too hard to handle as an individual handling it, and we should be aware of that. Suffering, I just want to point out something that one of the philosophers I talked to said. He pointed out that actually it brings me to this slide. Let me just, this is one slide that I wanted to end with, and we didn't do it. When we talk of the theologies that have been thinking about the nature of the self, much of what Buddhism came to, or the Advaitins came to, they came to it from the perspective of reducing suffering. Their philosophies came afterwards. In a sense, the ways in which they think about the self are in support of the fact that they want to reduce human suffering. And the Buddhist philosophy says our mistake lies in taking there to be one thing, the individual, when there are really the many. The many in this case they are talking about are the bundles of perceptions or the psychophysical elements, right? So there is no thing there, just the many, and it's the interaction of the many that gives rise to the appearance of a one. The Advaitins, remember I told you that there is a last line in that in each stanza of that poem, I am something. The Advaitin philosophy says, I am the witness consciousness. So there is they just talk of this witness consciousness that is the experiencer of everything without there being an individual, right? It's just moments of consciousness. And so they say, our mistake lies in taking there to be many meaning each one of us, there are many of us, when strictly speaking there is just the one. And you can see there are completely different perspectives on what the self might be and what consciousness might be, and who's to say who's right at this point. But they're both coming at it from the perspective of reducing suffering. It's because of misidentification, in one sense, from the Buddhist perspective, going one way, and the Advaitin perspective going the other way, that is the cause of the suffering. And this philosopher that I talked to said that the Buddhists would say that we set the bar for the self too high. We want it to be something, and actually, in all these conditions that we talked about where the self seems to be disintegrating, the suffering can come about if the culture demands that you be something, whereas the cultural self demands, a cultural notion of what one should be demands a certain level of cohesiveness, or whatever you might want to call it, the way one feels about oneself. But if there are cultures where there is a certain looseness to the perception of oneself, the suffering will be less, because you're all, and this comes down to Kay's idea of wanting to become something, and the becoming is an idea that's being fed, it's not just coming from within, it is all of us telling each other also at this point what we should be. So yeah, that's what I had to say, and maybe you can take the what
So for me, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It was very interesting to me that you also spoke about an internal context, leaving all social contexts aside. And an internal context you set for yourself can also create a lot of suffering in positioning your own experience. And this reminded me that pretty soon after Kay died, I also stopped reading Kay books, because I realized this can be something like drug abuse. You know, you get elated for a day or two and then you drop down again. But you can also set an internal context by overdosing on Krishnamurti. And this can create a specific form of suffering, because you may be one of those people who know the writings and the talks so well that they could actually go through the moves, you know, they could actually give a talk if they were forced to, because, you know, they know the wording and everything. And then, like many other people, they realize, but I don't change. You know, I have the strong internal context from being exposed to K, but this radical change in my life never happens. That's a specific form of suffering.
I mean, I can personally attest to that. It was not suffering as much as extreme discomfort to do with the idea of, you know, losing the distinction between the observer and the observed. It reappears and reappears in Kay's writings. It makes a lot of intellectual sense, but I could never internally come to that point. And for a while, there was stress associated with knowing what that might be, right? We set ourselves up for a lot of things, absolutely. But again, it's worth stressing that it is not any one individual's doing. These are ideas that permeate us, and they are everywhere. It's not like I suddenly one day decided that I'm going to do this and it's my responsibility. You know, these ideas, I stumbled on Kay's book in a used bookstore in Seattle when I was 24. I had no idea who he was. And I just picked up that book. It was You Are the World. It was on sale, which is why I picked it up. And I read it, and it disturbed me so much, because there were things he was saying that just shook me. And I didn't know what to make of it. The only thing I remember from those 2 years is I stopped taking photographs. That's all I can tell you. I don't know what that means. I stopped taking photographs. And so it's for each one of us to kind of take the things we read and, you know, and do exactly what Kay is saying, which is look at what's happening to you. I mean, you are the only laboratory there is for yourself, right? That's all. I don't even know how else to say that, right? That's all we have. And which is where, to me, science starts making contributions, is by saying, but doubt your own laboratory, right? Have doubts about this thing that you're so sure about, which is your perception. And that's, you know, and that wisdom is coming from a certain body of knowledge that is showing us that, look, hang on, you can't say that your perceptions are actually representing objective truth. Be doubtful. That's all.
Well, I just want to make a point about plasticity. 30 years ago, the assumption by science was that the brain was largely hardwired. That has now completely changed. And scientists could say, no, the plasticity of the brain and the extent of it is simply unknown. We now know that new neurons are created in the neocortex, relating to memory and to learning something new, and that the genes we have can be disabled or allowed to express by enhancing of the environment. So people who say, and I've done it myself, I haven't had one of these fundamental changes, have we really borne in mind that we are in a time in which the changeability of the brain is totally unknown?
You're saying that the extent of the plasticity is unknown. Yes and no, in the sense that we also know that there are certain regions of the brain that are so hardwired, which need to be for the organism to function as an organism, right? We can't interfere with the autonomic nervous system with any kind of sort of conscious awareness. There are claims of people who can do that, leaving that aside for now. No, so, I mean, I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying that I don't know what that might be like, and I can't comment on it. But there are aspects of the nervous system that are, it needs, for instance, to maintain the body in homeostasis. The core temperature needs to be maintained at 37 degrees centigrade. Now, you can't mess with that. That's not the kind of plasticity we are talking about. There are other kinds of plasticity. Yes, I agree with you. There's tremendous plasticity in the brain, and the extent of which was not understood, certainly, right? But it's also true to appreciate that a lot of why our bodies and brains work the way they do is because they are hardwired. Because, if we had 4 legs, we would have a different kind of wiring in our brain to be, we are bipedal, so our brains are wired to help us move on 2 legs. If we had 4 legs, we would be wired slightly differently, and you can't, that's not the kind of plasticity we're talking about. So it's both, and both are necessary. The reason why we are such effective learners is because of that plasticity, but we are also very efficient biological machines, which is because of the hard wiring. So they go hand in hand. I wouldn't kind of say one is better than the other. They have their places. Does that make sense?
Well, science was saying that we were hardwired. I mean, people really did believe that 30 years ago.
No, they may have 30 years ago. That I don't know what 30 years ago was, what was being said.
I think, for me, the delight of science is that it moves forward in the light of new discoveries.
Yeah.
And I think it, really querying a bit, you're saying, yes, well, wait a bit, we have got bits that are hardwired. How do we know that?
How do we know bits are hardwired?
Yes, how do we know that we have?
Oh, for a lot of the, so for instance, there are certain, you can have lesions in certain parts of the brain that will actually knock out very specific bits of functionality, right? Very, very specific. Like when I witnessed a neurosurgery in Zurich, where, one of these surgeries that I mentioned earlier, where someone with epilepsy was being implanted with electrodes so that they could then stimulate the brain to figure out what part of the brain tissue was epileptogenic, where the seizures were happening, so that they could then surgically take it out. And what neurologists do at that point when they have electrodes implanted is that they're actually stimulating certain parts of the brain to figure out if they take out this bit of the brain, does it affect the person's language ability or things. So at any given moment in a brain's, when you take that snapshot, there are certain things that are happening in certain parts. This is not to say that I'm actually at this point I think I'm kind of stepping outside my comfort with the subject, but within brains, within neuroscience, we do understand that there are certain regions that are doing certain things, and if you have a lesion in that part of the brain, you will suffer certain deficits, very specific deficits. So now, is that hardwired? Well, for that moment in time, yes, it is hardwired. Is the brain plastic enough to recover from that? For certain things, yes. For certain things, no. So do we know everything about it? Obviously not. It is a process of learning, but I think neuroscientists would say that there are specificities to functional, to brain tissue that can't be ignored. You can't just say every part of the brain is doing everything. It's not. It is specialized in certain ways, but it's the learning, the plasticity is what allows us to then, learn the way we do. We learn tremendous amounts in fantastic ways. If you witness the efforts going on in AI and deep learning to try and kind of come close to how the human brain learns, they're nowhere close. This is in that sense, an incredibly plastic machine. So, but the extent of all of that is, I mean, we're still in the process of figuring out, right?
So, thank you for talking. It was a really interesting talk, enjoyable. I'm still not convinced that it sheds any light on the teaching. I mean, it's interesting in itself and worthy of study. I guess my question, and I have several questions, but I mean, I would first ask, and it's just because I don't know, theory of mind. I mean, I've studied it from a social sciences context, but with theory of mind, is that something that an individual does at like a conscious level, or is it, you know, I know there's the thinking what's on this person's mind based on, you know, their body type, and there's part of that is conscious. But does it also happen at an unconscious level? It mostly happens at a unconscious level. It arises as a perception. Okay. So, and it's not something little children are able to do. Mm-hmm. So when you have a baby, you know, it's usually around the age of 3 to 4 years that they start demonstrating the ability to be able to imagine what is in someone else's mind. Yeah. And so it's a developmental process, and that developmental process is actually disrupted in autism. So someone with a child with autism will have difficulties with theory of mind, because the neural circuits that are, you know, talking about specificity of neural circuits, there is, you know, I think it's, if I can recollect my the brain regions, it's somewhere in the, you know, temporoparietal junction that you see sort of correlations in terms of activity of brain regions and the level of, or the extent of theory of mind that someone has or doesn't have. And what is very, very intriguing is that the ability that we develop in order to peer into someone else's mind in a manner of speaking is also, the same circuits are necessary for having insights into our own minds. So if you take, there have been sort of studies done with people with Asperger's where they're asked to reflect on their internal state at any given. There's a kind of test where they're carrying around a beeper which beeps randomly, and the moment the beeper beeps, the study involves them stopping seizing activity and trying to write down what they think is the content of their, you know, mind at that point. And it correlates with how well they do on the theory of mind task. The less well they do on it, the less their writings have reflections about feelings, about body states, about internal thoughts. So if you're lacking theory of mind, you're also lacking sometimes the ability to have introspective, awareness of your own internal states and your own feeling states. So people do compensate with it cognitively though. So if you're unable to, which is why if you, like one of the people with Asperger's that I talked to, he, you know, by the time he was in his 30s, had figured out how to do this, but he said it's extremely tiring because for people for whom this is an unconscious activity that just arises as a perception, it doesn't require sort of conscious cognitive activity, whereas for him it did. And he literally said, look, for me 30 minutes of socializing, which involves reading people's minds, is more tiring than a 3-hour calculus exam. Like he would rather do 3 hours of calculus than deal with people for, you know. So another question more kind of personal. Does your with your I'm sorry. This is real fast. Oh yeah. Real fast. Okay. Yeah. Your book, is it more about a variety of self or a variety of religious experience? What would you say?
I don't really touch on religious experiences. So it is really about trying to grapple with notions of the self by looking at the ways the self gets disrupted.
Okay.
Hi, Anil. Do you think that somehow the research at the moment is showing that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain? Somehow that is what is coming to, you know, to that's the result, but somehow, and if that's the case, so then I guess that means that subjective experience is part of that. So I was thinking, on one hand you have that, so then maybe that's all we are psychologically. And that could then be transferred to artificial intelligence, right? That actually maybe at some point, like in the same way that the brain gets to a point
you're saying that what we are could be transferred to an artificial
more than
or that we could build an artificial intelligence with its own consciousness.
We could build artificial intelligence and then maybe consciousness would emerge there too if it reaches a certain level of complexity in the same way that the brain has reached. So it's more like, what's your view on that? I know that it's like a hot topic at the moment.
It's a hot topic. The notion that consciousness is an emergent property, I think, is broadly accepted within neuroscience. I don't personally know of anyone, I mean, there might be people, but I personally don't know of any neuroscientists who would disagree with that statement fundamentally, that consciousness is an emergent property. Now, but what consciousness is, once it emerges, is a matter of dispute, right? And so that's where we were getting to earlier, that what is what emerges something immaterial, right? If it is immaterial, then it gives rise to something called the hard problem of consciousness, which is how does a material brain give rise to something immaterial, and how does that immaterial thing then interact with the material brain using the known physics. We have nothing in physics that suggests how that interaction could happen, nothing in physics that suggests what that immaterial thing could be, right? So there's a matter, that's one point of debate. So there are people who will say that no, there is nothing immaterial. It's the immateriality of consciousness that is an illusion, and that's what we need to explain, not that there is something immaterial appearing, right? Again, there are views about the fact that it's the structure of the brain and the complexity taken together somehow are responsible for the emergence of consciousness, without saying whether it's material or immaterial, right? Obviously, our phenomenal experience is that there is something we call consciousness. So, yes, so one can, and there are arguments to say that it doesn't just depend on the fact that the brain is a wet neural biological system, that if you could somehow replicate the complexity and the structure in silico, sure, that should also have similar consciousness. But it's a matter of dispute. It's not a settled question. There are philosophers who will say, no, it is actually a property of a wet neural system. You couldn't possibly have it in silicon. There are others who would say, no, you can simulate the whole thing inside a computer, the complexity, and that simulation should be complex. There are others who will disagree with that, who will say that you can simulate the complexity of the entire brain inside a computer, but a simulation can never be conscious, even though it is simulating all the complexity. So all these arguments are going back and forth. My personal take, I don't feel comfortable saying what I feel about these things, because they are just that. I mean, it's informed by a lot of reading, but given that there's substantial gaps in these areas, it feels uncomfortable. But personally, I would say I am leaning more and more towards the idea that consciousness is an illusion, and what our task is as scientists or anyone who's interested in consciousness is to figure out why does the illusion of immateriality come about, and then understanding what is it about the structure of the brain and the wiring, etc., the way the information is being processed, that gives rise to this illusion.
I guess, sorry if I can, I mean, the question for me relates to if that is the case, but clearly, I mean, it's a bit of a mystery at the moment, right? Then it would be interesting to see where do we place, this, if there is any other aspect apart from matter. Sometimes I feel that Krishnamurti brings that aspect when he mentions the sacred or the immeasurable. And of course, this is not the question, like I'm not requiring to have an answer about that, but that's really interesting to ponder what would mean if actually consciousness ultimately is a materialistic process, and maybe that's all there is to it.
Sorry, Pratik, you wanted to say something? So I mean, I think there is a.
You raise your hands. I walked over to you and closed it. No. So now you have to take it. Yes.
Okay, take it. Patrick would. Go on, go. No, I mean, so we're talking of someone's perception, right? When Krishnamurti says something, or anyone says something, we're talking of their perception of reality. And I wouldn't even know where to start explaining that, in the sense that I don't even know what that means on a personal level. What does that sacredness? I've read the same things. I've read his notebook where he talks about the presence of the benevolence, the sacred. Now, does it say to me that there is something outside? No, it doesn't. All it says to me that his state of mind is one that is perceiving a certain, that is his perception of his environment and himself at that point. I don't see personally any way of saying that implies something extra. But at the same time, if you ask me for proof to support my statement, I'd have none either. So.
Yeah, so I'm not sure why Francisco is asking questions that he already has answers to, at least some of them. But Francisco knows that there are broadly two ways of looking at something when there's uncertainty, and your rope and snake thing is a good thing. So one way of looking is to maximize the likelihood of determining the fact of the matter, whether it's a rope or snake. The other way of looking is to maximize a distortion or a bias. And then the two biases, one is it's a snake when it's actually a rope, and the other bias is it's a rope when it's actually a snake. And we know, and this has been replicated thousands of times, that the brain is built absolutely not to recognize the fact of the matter, number one. And number two, that it's built to resort to a bias of the false positive, which is this is a snake and not the other way around. Now, building on that, and he also knows what the adaptive significance of this is, what the consequences
he
are
meaning
for
Francisco.
brain. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to put it all back on him because he knows this stuff. So he has no
excuse.
Exactly. So that's number one. So clearly, it's well established that in certain circumstances, it's more adaptive to see things in a biased way than the fact of the matter. That's really pretty solid.
Right.
And how that happens and why it happens is clearly worked out. There's very little controversy about that. Number two, the bigger question of sort of a bigger belief, like let's pick religiosity. So it's also fairly well worked out, and I think he knows that too, that when explanations were sought, there were a variety of choices that the brains of different people could engage in. So some people would look for an answer in tangible, explainable, observable things, and others found answers, or at least thought of possibilities of divine, religious, the notion of God, and so on. And this was at a time when there was a divergence of these. So now, if I, for whatever reason, have a tendency to resonate with the God answer, as opposed to Stephen, who has a tendency not to resonate with the God answer, but with something very tangible, explainable, and so on, it's well known why the tendency to resonate with the God answer had an adaptive fitness in a population, because it allowed identification with something big that allowed massive degrees of cooperation that wasn't possible prior to that, which is why one of the reasons why humans, the scale of cooperation between humans is orders of magnitude more than it is between non-human primates, who also cooperate, but what a difference in the level. And that could only have come about when there was an adaptive significance to having a certain kind of belief. So when you say something that you started with that I've forgotten, about, consciousness sitting out there and being in touch with it versus an emergent property. There's no contradiction, there's no conflict between the notion of developing a system that sees things a certain way and then that becoming the norm in a population over time because of what it does. That has absolutely nothing to do with the fact of the matter. The fact of the matter doesn't even come into this equation of why we got to be the way we are and how things move, and you know that. So anyway.
I know more. So I think my question was mainly regarding this subjective experience, and some people call it the sense of qualia, basically, which is this sense of being something, being somebody. And even though maybe we can explain consciousness in terms of behavior, and it ends up being an emergent property of consciousness, being an emergent property of the brain, it feels that we might, the issue that seems that to not be clear in research, and this is, this is why I'm asking, this is what I don't know, is really if it's, that's why I brought the idea of artificial intelligence, and somehow the sense of qualia, or the sense of being something, would be even transferred to artificial intelligence. That could mean that then basically we just have a materialistic process going on, and there is maybe no there is no other part in our psychological being that somehow is no materialistic. I think that's what I was coming from. I don't know if that's what Batik was actually saying that I knew already, but for me it's like something that it seems unresolved.
Well, it is, and you're not the only one who feels unresolved about it. I mean, that is unresolved in neuroscience and philosophy. If you go to a consciousness conference and have 5 philosophers sit down and talk about consciousness, they are arguing about exactly that. So there is an explanatory gap. So there is a gap in trying to figure out how something material, like the brain, gives rise to conscious experience, which seems to have an immaterial property. Seems to have. Well, it's how it feels to us. So now, no, but that is the beginning of our analysis. That's where we begin with, right? So that's why we argue about these things, because it feels to us a certain way. Then you bring in other tools to start kind of winnowing these arguments and figuring out, what might be right. And that's what philosophers are doing. Actually, you're deeply into Thomas's territory now. So we should just give him the podium and have him talk for half an hour. He's shaking his head no. Sorry, Peter. You have to answer it. Okay.
Well, just a quick comment on that. It might be that the reason this is not resolved, that it cannot be resolved, it might be a paradoxical assumption that there are two different things and one gives rise to the other. So if the premise that we start from is paradoxical, there's never going to be a solution to that, and maybe we're caught up in that. But apart from that, I just wanted you to clarify something for me. I got a little bit confused. Earlier you said that, and I really just want to understand it, I haven't got an agenda behind, I thought I don't get that bit. Earlier you said that you think that consciousness is an illusion. Presumably you would think now, and I don't know, that you're conscious. How does illusion fit with that? So, because you said that you think that consciousness is an illusion, and I just simply, maybe it's a shortcoming, I can't get my head around you being conscious and saying that it's an illusion.
No, so I really, I'm on very, very dicey territory here, even personally, right? I am just beginning to intuitively get to understanding what philosophers mean when they say it's an illusion, and it would be completely wrong on my part to try and tell you what that means. I have struggled with that, like, because this is exactly what somebody like Daniel Dennett says, and for the longest time, I could not even understand what he was going on about. And there's just the glimmerings of understanding that's developing about what is it he's getting at, and I would be remiss to start trying to pontificate about that. Honestly, it is a difficult subject, and if you can hold that question, ask Thomas tomorrow. So, because you know.
I was just wondering why you said it.
No, that is a philosophical position, right? And I somewhere am beginning to see what that means, right? But going anywhere beyond that, for me personally, would be really, I'll be sinking. So I'm going to stop here about consciousness.
So the least that there could be a robot that is not conscious, but at least talks like you talk and asks the very same question. That would be possible, right? So I don't know if the rest is possible, to have exactly the microfunctional structure that your brain has and be a zombie. I don't think that's possible in any world. But maybe we are fundamentally mistaken in the way we describe our inner lives. It's a possibility. But I wanted to come back to this because I realized this material or immaterial is very important to many of you. So first I just wanted to report from philosophy. It actually doesn't mean much. There are almost no people who would think that consciousness is a substance in the sense that it could exist independently of the physical brain. But there are many people who are anti-reductionists and anti-naturalists and who think that phenomenal properties, as we say, conscious properties, cannot be conceptually reduced to anything in the physical world. And there are some people, there's a fad that's called panpsychism. It's an old idea. Could it be everywhere? You know,
everything could be conscious to some degree.
In a minimal degree, I think that doesn't work. But there are many anti-reductionists, but I think the deeper issue behind this old-fashioned and outdated distinction between matter and mind is mortality denial. The reason why we are so interested in this is because we want to find a way out of this possible confrontation with our own, I guess, finitude is the English word or so, our own mortality. That's the driving motivation that makes the question so interesting to us, and that is maybe also a connection to the teachings again, you know, that the real problem is to face the fact that, as Kay said, death may be around the next corner, and that's the condition under which we exist. This might end very soon at any point in time. And that's why it becomes so important, you know. If conscious experience could go on after the death of the body, if you had accepted your mortality, you would probably think this is something for, you know.
Philosophers.
Yeah.
Like
These,
you.
yeah. I don't do metaphysics, you know. This is a metaphysical question. You've also made the distinction very often. The problem of self as a metaphysical problem, does something like that exist? And the problem of self as a phenomenological problem, you know, in our experience. So my prediction is, if the mortality denial was resolved, you wouldn't be interested in the question anymore.
So, Anil, thank you. And I don't know if either you or Thomas could talk to me a little bit about this in terms of where science and neuropsychology is on the issue. Quite often when we are talking about the self, we talk about it situated primarily within this sort of physical organism, although you've pointed out examples of it being dislocated and out-of-body experiences and so on. And I don't want to edge towards some kind of a panpsychism kind of position, but just if we think about the reality of our existence, in order for me to survive, I need to be aware that there's some food out there for me to consume. So my very existence, in some sense, is in some sense fundamentally related to me recognizing things in the environment around me that are outside of me, that I must feed upon, that I must go and pick and choose and consume. So, because without those, I perish, right? So there's some fundamental interconnectedness between what is out there and my very being, to some extent. To exist, to have taken this embodied form, two human beings had to somehow see each other, and maybe some light vibrations of the shape of that woman and that man, and some words that they uttered, some kind of vibrations they produced in terms of language, attracted each other to each other to get together in one of the most intimate kinds of interactions in order to produce a being that had consciousness, which was me. So I couldn't come into existence without two interconnected beings who were so loosely connected with each other that mere light rays or sound vibrations brought them together to manifest as me. So I wonder about that, because this isn't going off into the realm of the airy-fairy. It's a very pragmatic, real way in which human beings come into existence and consciousness takes form within individuals. And it seems that that requires an interconnectedness that that crosses from the embodied self to, say, other human beings, but I'm also feeding on other species and so on and so forth, so that there's some fundamental connectedness that life seems to share. And I think the self is somehow intrinsically tied to all of that. So that's why I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, you don't even have to come to humans to talk about this, right? Every animal does this, right? So life, by its very nature, has the notion of us. Every bacterial cell, every single cell knows, without giving it sort of, I'm putting it in quotes, its boundaries. There is a certain physical integrity to a cell that it needs to maintain, and part of the process of doing that is this idea that it is separate from the things outside. It needs to know that something is a toxin versus something is food, right? There are mechanisms. So, and this notion of the self and the other starts at that level. And Patek would argue that it would probably be in organic chemistry. You don't even have to come to life forms to start talking about this. And so this self versus other distinction is, an absolutely essential feature of life. And you can keep going up that hierarchy from single cells to multicellularity to organs. Why can't we just randomly transplant my organ into yours? Your body will reject it, because there is a notion that it has of an immune self that is very different from mine, and this self is poison to that, unless it's a perfect match, right? So, and this is why people having organ transplants have to take immunosuppressant drugs. You're telling the immune system, please ignore this foreign body in your body that we are transplanting. So I completely agree with you. It is, the interconnectedness is just the interconnectedness of organisms that are living, and you can talk about it in psychological terms. You can talk about it in purely mechanistic terms. When you have a swarm, I don't know if they're called a swarm of bacteria. There must be a term for what you say for a bunch of bacteria, colony of bacteria. Well, they are, they're incredibly interconnected. Yeah, and but you can see that mechanistically at some level. And this comes to the point of what we were saying earlier, that by the time we start talking about interconnectedness at the level of culture and human beings, we're talking of very complex systems. And I'm not sure it's that easy to unpick and unpack and say, okay, this is what interconnection means, right? Interconnection could just mean something like, you said something today that affected me and entered my thought patterns, and I might never see you again. But what you said, which influenced me, will now influence me for the rest of my life. That is an interconnectedness. But that's an interconnectedness of a cultural sort, right? I mean, it happens all the time. So I don't know which level at which to analyze this, but yes, regardless of which level you take, you can say this is what that interconnected means. At this level of bacteria, it's just the molecules they're exchanging that somehow is signaling that they have to behave this way, that way. Swarm of birds, when they do their murmuring, like it's amazing, right? No individual bird knows what the bird at the end of the murmur is doing, but boy, do they have these amazing patterns. Well, that's a very easily explained physical phenomena, right?
Can I quickly add something? Who was it earlier today who said that we are also fascinated with ourselves? Was it you? Well, you may find this interesting. There's a wonderful senior researcher in England by the name of Nicholas Humphrey, and he has an interesting theory of consciousness, which basically says what it adds, the function, is that we get terribly fascinated
by ourselves.
By ourselves and with reality as such. And that resonates a bit with the point I think you were making. I just want to say there's a way of expressing this in very traditional Buddhist terminology too. Consciousness could be that what makes a really nasty form of attachment possible, of identification. It could be exactly the nasty, ugly, suffering-provoking invention of evolution that drives organisms forward by making them identify with their own desires, wishes, get glued to them because it's so damn fascinating. You know? That might spill over into social interactions too.
Yeah. I mean, actually, this is an interesting thread of conversation, because one of the things we keep hearing from, when we read thinkers about the self, especially theologians and certain philosophers, is that, whether it's Buddhist or Advaitin or we can find this anywhere, but the idea that the self is the problem, right? And from what Hilary was just saying and what we've been talking, the notion of the self, depending on what unit you're looking at, is very necessary for the biological organism to survive, right? So where does, for when we all intuitively also kind of understand, yes, the self is a problem, but without a notion of the self, without a certain kind of bodily integrity to this organism, for instance, if the mechanisms that protect this body from running into a car that is going on the road are not active, if you just cross the road and whatever the biological imperative is that prevents you from stepping into the path of an oncoming car where to go away, well, that particular biological self is dead. It's going to step in and be crushed by a car. There's something that will, I don't know how many of you have thought about this. There are so many times in London, when I was living in London, when I would be standing in a tube station, crowded tube station, right next to the edge of the platform, wondering, why don't any of us just jump, right? There is something that it's a thought that occurs. I don't know I don't know whether it occurs to all the people standing there, but I would think about this. I would think about, so what is, I know I wouldn't jump. I would think about, why is it that there is a biological resistance or a cognitive resistance, call it what you may. I don't want to distinguish this, it's a continuum. It doesn't let me jump unless I'm suicidal, right? So as long as I'm not suicidal, there is resistance to that. Why, right? So there is something about our cognitive selves, our bodily selves, that is preserving itself, and that's a biological function. Somewhere along the line, the evolution of this self, and so some of us here will think of self in terms of evolution, and we'll hear other opinions later, I think. But the idea that somewhere along the path of the evolution of the self, it became a problem, which is what I think a lot of us keep alluding to, that there is There is this conflict. There is, we can't quite get hold of what that is. And a very simplistic way in which I have been thinking about it is that imagine that there is no conceptual self, there is no consciousness. The body still needs to have a sense of self. It might not be conscious of that self. It is navigating its environment, doing what it's doing, surviving. And then somewhere along the course of evolution, self-awareness comes about, right? And it's still self-aware about the bodily self, that it's still moving around. And the way the brain seems to function is that our actions are dictated by certain emotions you feel. So if there's fear or anxiety, it's a signal for the biological organism to move away from something. And seeking pleasure is basically, or seeking food is an act of going towards things that are useful for survival. So there is this is one axis of analysis. There can be multiple axes in which you can analyze this. But say that your first moment of self-awareness in the scheme of evolution is just awareness of this bodily self that is moving around looking for food. And there must be animals like that. There must be animals. I feel that a lot of people feel that they must be aware of the bodily self just moving around, nothing more, right? And then somewhere along evolution now, certain systems develop within our brain which give us this ability to move forward and backward in time. Our narrative self starts developing, right? Now, that narrative self, in order for it to have any effect on the body, has to couple to the very same systems that are making the body move towards things that help survival and move away from things that are bad for survival, right? So things that give you pleasure and joy, however you want to say it, but there are things you move towards that are important for survival, things you move away from. So the conceptual self that's beginning to develop, which is now based on memory and thought, and is still coupled to the body, right? So now you can imagine a scenario. These are just so stories of evolution, but just bear with me for a second. You can imagine in the early stages of the development of ourself a point where the person is now able to plan ahead, which is partly why this kind of ability has evolved. Plan ahead, and you can imagine scenarios where thinking about scarcity makes you anxious. Thinking about abundance makes you feel okay. So if there is a perception of scarcity in the future, that manifests itself as a feeling in the body that is then forcing you to act. You'll do something. You'll go, gather some food and keep it in your fridge, whatever, right? Or maybe the fridge wasn't there in those times, but you can imagine, right? Now, the key point here is this conceptual self that is developing, which is still functioning on a survival base. It's still sort of looking for food, looking for ways to survive, avoiding danger, etc., but is now able to plan a little bit. It still has to be mediated via the body. It still has to be mediated via the sensations that arise in the body that tell the body, for the mind-body, brain-body complex, to act. That conceptual self now, at the stage at which we are in our evolution as humans, is so far removed from those early days. We can now conceptualize things that we want or things that we may not have that actually have nothing to do with the physical survival of this organism, right? It hasn't. So, you can imagine, and this is an example I take, and I've already talked to a few of you before about this. But I think about if you take a billionaire who has lost 500 million for whatever reason, and if you take someone on the streets who has $10, only $10, and has lost those $10, both are going to feel a certain sense of loss, right? But in one case, the loss of the $10, the only $10 that the homeless man had, is actually very pertinent to the survival of that person, because it means now that there is no food that night. For the person who has lost 500 million out of a billion, it still feels the same way. It's a hole in the, it's a pit in your stomach, or however you want to call it. There is a debilitating feeling of loss, but it has no impact whatsoever on the physical survival of that person, because he still has 500 million. So the conceptual self now is dictating how we can envision what we are, and that conceptual self has no bounds. It is a runaway process. That there is no feedback mechanism that is controlling, how much we let this conceptual aggrandization go on, right? To me, it's that part of the self that we need to be worried about. There are other parts that are incredibly important for just being humans, for interacting, for relating to each other. So we can't just make a blanket statement that the self is the problem. What is it about the self? We need to start figuring out. And so for me, this way of thinking has really helped clarify, that it's a fact that the conceptual self has no boundaries. You can, and we know examples of that are happening right now. That and climate change is a consequence of an unbounded conceptual self. And there are other cognitive biases that lead to it also. But one of the reasons is that we all want way more than we need for physical survival. Period. I mean, if 7 billion people on the planet all want the same level of sort of, material stuff to survive as the average person in America, then we're done. Right? We're already done, I think. But so anyway.